The deep darkness beneath the earth awaits us. In the previous chapter, Professor Leidenbrock, young Axel, and their guide Hans began an impossible journey, a descent through a volcano, heading straight into the heart of the planet. Are you ready? Because right now, we continue the journey to the center of the earth, part 2, where every step may lead to wonder or to destruction. But what lies ahead is more than stone, shadows, and danger. It is secrets buried for millions of years, visions no one would believe, and moments powerful enough to shake the human mind. It must in all truth be confessed, things as yet had gone on well, and I should have acted in bad taste to have complained. If the true medium of our difficulties did not increase, it was within the range of possibility that we might ultimately reach the end of our journey. Then what glory would be ours? I began in the newly aroused ardor of my soul to speak enthusiastically to the professor. Well, was I serious? The whole state in which we existed was a mystery, and it was impossible to know whether or not I was in earnest. For several days after our memorable halt, the slopes became more rapid, some were even of a most frightful character, almost vertical, so that we were forever going down into the solid interior mass. During some days, we actually descended 1.5 leagues, even 2 leagues towards the center of the earth. The descents were sufficiently perilous, and while we were engaged in them, we learned fully to appreciate the marvelous coolness of our guide, Hans. Without him, we should have been wholly lost. The grave and impassible Icelander devoted himself to us with the most incomprehensible sang-froid and ease, and thanks to him, many a dangerous pass was got over, where, but for him, we should inevitably have stuck fast. His silence increased every day. I think that we began to be influenced by this peculiar trait in his character. It is certain that the inanimate objects by which you are surrounded have a direct action on the brain. It must be that a man who shuts himself up between 4 walls must lose the faculty of associating ideas and words. How many persons condemned to the horrors of solitary confinement have gone mad simply because the thinking faculties have lain dormant? During the 2 weeks that followed our last interesting conversation, there occurred nothing worthy of being especially recorded. I have, while writing these memoirs, taxed my memory in vain for one incident of travel during this particular period. But the next event to be related is terrible indeed. Its very memory, even now, makes my soul shudder and my blood run cold. It was on the 7th of August. Our constant and successive descents had taken us quite 30 leagues into the interior of the earth. That is to say that there were above us 30 leagues, nearly 100 miles of rocks and oceans, and continents, and towns, to say nothing of living inhabitants. We were in a southeasterly direction, about 200 leagues from Iceland. On that memorable day, the tunnel had begun to assume an almost horizontal course. I was on this occasion walking on in front. My uncle had charge of one of the Ruhmkorff coils. I had possession of the other. By means of its light, I was busy examining the different layers of granite. I was completely absorbed in my work. Suddenly halting and turning round, I found that I was alone. Well, thought I to myself, I have certainly been walking too fast, or else Hans and my uncle have stopped to rest. The best thing I can do is to go back and find them. Luckily, there is very little ascent to tire me. I accordingly retraced my steps and, while doing so, walked for at least 1/4 hour. Rather uneasy, I paused and looked eagerly around. Not a living soul, I called aloud. No reply. My voice was lost amid the myriad cavernous echoes it aroused. I began for the first time to feel seriously uneasy. A cold shiver shook my whole body, and perspiration, chill and terrible, burst upon my skin. I must be calm, I said, speaking aloud, as boys whistle to drive away fear. There can be no doubt that I shall find my companions. There cannot be 2 roads. It is certain that I was considerably ahead. All I have to do is to go back. Having come to this determination, I ascended the tunnel for at least half an hour, unable to decide if I had ever seen certain landmarks before. Every now and then, I paused to discover if any loud appeal was made to me, while knowing that in that dense and intensified atmosphere I should hear it a long way off. But no, the most extraordinary silence reigned in this immense gallery. Only the echoes of my own footsteps could be heard. At last I stopped. I could scarcely realize the fact of my isolation. I was quite willing to think that I had made a mistake, but not that I was lost. If I had made a mistake, I might find my way. If lost, I shuddered to think of it. Come, come, said I to myself. Since there is only one road, and they must come by it, we shall at last meet. All I have to do is still to go upwards. Perhaps, however, not seeing me, and forgetting I was ahead, they may have gone back in search of me. Still, even in this case, if I make haste, I shall get up to them. There can be no doubt about the matter. But as I spoke these last words aloud, it would have been quite clear to any listener had there been one that I was by no means convinced of the fact. Moreover, in order to associate together these simple ideas, and to reunite them under the form of reasoning, required some time. I could not all at once bring my brain to think. Then another dread doubt fell upon my soul. After all, was I ahead? Of course I was. Hans was no doubt following behind, preceded by my uncle. I perfectly recollected his having stopped for a moment to strap his baggage on his shoulder. I now remembered this trifling detail. It was, I believe, just at that very moment that I had determined to continue my route. Again, thought I, reasoning as calmly as was possible, there is another sure means of not losing my way, a thread to guide me through the labyrinthine subterraneous retreat, one which I had forgotten, my faithful river. This course of reasoning roused my drooping spirits, and I resolved to resume my journey without further delay. No time was to be lost. It was at this moment that I had reason to bless the thoughtfulness of my uncle, when he refused to allow the eider hunter to close the orifices of the hot spring, that small fissure in the great mass of granite. This beneficent spring, after having saved us from thirst during so many days, would now enable me to regain the right road. Having come to this mental decision, I made up my mind, before I started upwards, that ablution would certainly do me a great deal of good. I stopped to plunge my hands and forehead in the pleasant water of the Hansbach stream, blessing its presence as a certain consolation. Conceive my horror and stupefaction. I was treading a hard, dusty, shingly road of granite. The stream on which I reckoned had wholly disappeared. No words in any human language can depict my utter despair. I was literally buried alive, with no other expectation before me but to die in all the slow, horrible torture of hunger and thirst. Mechanically, I crawled about, feeling the dry and arid rock. Never to my fancy had I ever felt anything so dry. But I frantically asked myself, how had I lost the course of the flowing stream? There could be no doubt it had ceased to flow in the gallery in which I now was. Now I began to understand the cause of the strange silence which prevailed when last I tried if any appeal from my companions might perchance reach my ear. It so happened that when I first took an imprudent step in the wrong direction, I did not perceive the absence of the all-important stream. It was now quite evident that when we halted, another tunnel must have received the waters of the little torrent, and that I had unconsciously entered a different gallery. To what unknown depths had my companions gone? Where was I? How to get back? Clue or landmark there was absolutely none. My feet left no signs on the granite and shingle. My brain throbbed with agony as I tried to discover the solution of this terrible problem. My situation, after all sophistry and reflection, had finally to be summed up in 3 awful words: lost, 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 at a depth which, to my finite understanding, appeared to be immeasurable. These 30 leagues of the crust of the earth weighed upon my shoulders, like the globe on the shoulders of Atlas. I felt myself crushed by the awful weight. It was indeed a position to drive the sanest man to madness. I tried to bring my thoughts back to the things of the world so long forgotten. It was with the greatest difficulty that I succeeded in doing so. Hamburg, the house on the Königstrasse, my dear cousin Gretchenall, that world which had before vanished like a shadow floated before my now vivid imagination. There they were before me, but how unreal. Under the influence of a terrible hallucination, I saw all the incidents of our journey pass before me like the scenes of a panorama. The ship and its inmates, Iceland, M. Fredriksson, and the great summit of Mount Sneffels. I said to myself that, if in my position I retained the most faint and shadowy outline of a hope, it would be a sure sign of approaching delirium. It were better to give way wholly to despair. In fact, did I but reason with calmness and philosophy, what human power was there in existence able to take me back to the surface of the earth? who could enable me to find my road and regain my companions. Insensate folly and madness to entertain even a shadow of hope. "Oh, uncle," was my despairing cry. This was the only word of reproach which came to my lips. When I at last began to resign myself to the fact that no further aid was to be expected from man, and knowing that I was utterly powerless to do anything for my own salvation, I kneeled with earnest fervor and asked assistance from heaven. The remembrance of my innocent childhood, the memory of my mother, known only in my infancy, came welling forth from my heart. I had recourse to prayer, and little as I had a right to be remembered by him whom I had forgotten in the hour of prosperity, and whom I so tardily invoked, I prayed earnestly and sincerely. This renewal of my youthful faith brought about a much greater amount of calm, and I was enabled to concentrate all my strength and intelligence on the terrible realities of my unprecedented situation. I had about me that which I had at first wholly forgotten: 3 days' provisions. Moreover, my water bottle was quite full. Nevertheless, the one thing which it was impossible to do was to remain alone. Try to find my companions I must, at any price. By doing this with care and coolness, I must reach the point where I had turned away from the rippling stream. I must find the fatal bifurcation or fork. Once the river at my feet, I could, at all events, regain the awful crater of Mount Sneffels. After a slight meal and a draught of water, I rose like a giant refreshed. Leaning heavily on my pole, I began the ascent of the gallery. The slope was very rapid and rather difficult, but I advanced hopefully and carefully, like a man who at last is making his way out of a forest. During 1 whole hour, nothing happened to check my progress. As I advanced, I tried to recollect the shape of the tunnel, to recall to my memory certain projections of rocks, to persuade myself that I had followed certain winding routes before. But no one particular sign could I bring to mind, and I was soon forced to allow that this gallery would never take me back to the point at which I had separated myself from my companions. It was absolutely without issue, a mere blind alley in the earth. The moment at length came when, facing the solid rock, I knew my fate, and fell inanimate on the arid floor. To describe the horrible state of despair and fear into which I then fell would now be vain and impossible. My last hope, the courage which had sustained me, drooped before the sight of this pitiless granite rock, lost in a vast labyrinth, the sinuosities of which spread in every direction. Without guide, clue, or compass, I knew it was a vain and useless task to attempt flight. All that remained to me was to lie down and die. To lie down and die, the most cruel and horrible of deaths. In my state of mind, the idea came into my head that one day, perhaps, when my fossil bones were found, their discovery might give rise to solemn discussions. I tried to cry aloud, but hoarse, hollow, and inarticulate sounds alone could make themselves heard through my parched lips. I literally panted for breath. In the midst of all these horrible sources of anguish and despair, a new horror took possession of my soul. My lamp, by falling down, had got out of order. I had no means of repairing it. Its light was already becoming paler and paler, and soon would expire. With a strange sense of resignation and despair, I watched the luminous current in the coil getting less and less. A procession of shadows moved flashing along the granite wall. I scarcely dared to lower my eyelids, fearing to lose the last spark of this fugitive light. At last, one final trembling flame remained in the lamp. I followed it with all my power of vision. I gasped for breath. I concentrated upon it all the power of my soul, as upon the last scintillation of light I was ever destined to see. A wild and plaintive cry escaped my lips. On earth, during the most profound and comparatively complete darkness, light never allows a complete destruction and extinction of its power. In this place, nothing the absolute obscurity made me blind in every sense. My head was now wholly lost. I raised my arms, trying the effects of the feeling in getting against the cold stone wall. It was painful in the extreme. Madness must have taken possession of me. I began to run, to fly, rushing at haphazard in this inextricable labyrinth. Several hours passed in this way. After a long time, having utterly exhausted my strength, I fell a heavy inert mass along the side of the tunnel, and lost consciousness. When at last I came back to a sense of life and being, my face was wet, but wet, as I soon knew, with tears. How long this state of insensibility lasted, it is quite impossible for me now to say. I had no means left to me of taking any account of time. Never since the creation of the world had such a solitude as mine existed. I was completely abandoned. After my fall, I lost much blood. I felt myself flooded with the life-giving liquid. My first sensation was perhaps a natural one. Why was I not dead? Because I was alive, there was something left to do. I tried to make up my mind to think no longer. As far as I was able, I drove away all ideas, and utterly overcome by pain and grief, I crouched against the granite wall. I just commenced to feel the fainting coming on again, and the sensation that this was the last struggle before complete annihilation when, on a sudden, a violent uproar reached my ears. It had some resemblance to the prolonged rumbling voice of thunder, and I clearly distinguished sonorous voices, lost one after the other, in the distant depths of the gulf. Whence came this noise? Naturally, it was to be supposed from new phenomena which were taking place in the bosom of Mother Earth. The explosion of some gaseous vapors, or the fall of some solid, of the granitic or other rock. Again I listened with deep attention. I was extremely anxious to hear if this strange and inexplicable sound was likely to be renewed. A whole quarter of an hour elapsed in painful expectation. Deep and solemn silence reigned in the tunnel, so still that I could hear the beatings of my own heart. I waited with a strange kind of hopefulness. Suddenly my ear, which leaned accidentally against the wall, appeared to catch, as it were, the faintest echo of a sound. I thought that I heard vague, incoherent, and distant voices. I quivered all over with excitement and hope. It must be hallucination, I cried. It cannot be. It is not true. But no. By listening more attentively, I really did convince myself that what I heard was truly the sound of human voices. To make any meaning out of the sound, however, was beyond my power. I was too weak even to hear distinctly. Still, it was a positive fact that someone was speaking. Of that I was quite certain. There was a moment of fear. A dread fell upon my soul that it might be my own words, brought back to me by a distant echo. Perhaps without knowing it, I might have been crying aloud. I resolutely closed my lips, and once more placed my ear to the huge granite wall. Yes, for certain. It was in truth the sound of human voices. I now, by the exercise of great determination, dragged myself along the sides of the cavern, until I reached a point where I could hear more distinctly. But though I could detect the sound, I could only make out uncertain, strange, and incomprehensible words. They reached my ear as if they had been spoken in a low tone, murmured, as it were, afar off. At last I made out the word, repeated several times in a tone betokening great mental anguish and sorrow. What could this word mean, and who was speaking it? It must be either my uncle or the guide Hans. If therefore I could hear them, they must surely be able to hear me. Help! I cried at the top of my voice. Help! I am dying. I then listened with scarcely a breath. I panted for the slightest sound in the darkness, a cry, a sigh, a question, but silence reigned supreme. No answer came. In this way some minutes passed. A whole flood of ideas flashed through my mind. I began to fear that my voice, weakened by sickness and suffering, could not reach my companions who were in search of me. It must be they, I cried. Who else could by any possibility be buried 100 miles below the level of the earth? The mere supposition was preposterous. I began therefore to listen again, with the most breathless attention. As I moved my ears along the side of the place I was in, I found a mathematical point, as it were, where the voices appeared to attain their maximum of intensity. The word "forlorad" again distinctly reached my ear. Then came again that rolling noise like thunder which had awakened me out of torpor. I begin to understand, I said to myself. It is not through the solid mass that the sound reaches my ears. The walls are of solid granite, and the most fearful explosion would not make uproar enough to penetrate them. The sound must come along the gallery itself. The place I was in must possess some peculiar acoustic properties of its own. Again I listened, and this time, yes, this time, I heard my name distinctly pronounced, cast, as it were, into space. It was my uncle, the professor, who was speaking. He was in conversation with the guide, and the word which had so often reached my ears, forlorad, was a Danish expression. Then I understood it all. In order to make myself heard, I too must speak, as it were, along the side of the gallery, which would carry the sound of my voice just as the wire carries the electric fluid from point to point. But there was no time to lose. If my companions were only to remove a few feet from where they stood, the acoustic effect would be over. My whispering gallery would be destroyed. I again therefore crawled towards the wall, and said as clearly and distinctly as I could, "Uncle Hardwigg." I then awaited a reply. Sound does not possess the property of traveling with such extreme rapidity. Besides, the density of the air at that depth was far from adding to the rapidity of circulation. Several seconds elapsed, appearing ages to me, and these words reached my eager ears, and moved my wildly beating heart. "Harry, my boy, is that you?" A short delay between question and answer. "Yes, yes. Where are you?" "Lost, and your lamp out, but the guiding stream is lost." "Keep your courage, Harry. We will do our best." "One moment, my uncle," I cried. "I have no longer strength to answer your questions. But for heaven's sake, do you continue to speak to me." Absolute silence, I felt, would be annihilation. "Keep up your courage," said my uncle. "As you are so weak, do not speak. We have been searching for you in all directions, both upwards and downwards." I had begun to give over all hope, and you can never know what bitter tears I have shed. At last, supposing you to be still on the road beside the Hansbach, we again descended, firing off guns as signals. Now that we have found you, and our voices reach each other, it may be a long time before we actually meet. But do not despair. It is something gained even to hear each other. While he was speaking, my brain was at work reflecting. An undefined hope, vague and shapeless, as yet, made my heart beat wildly. First, it was necessary to know one thing: the distance between us. I leaned my head against the wall, almost touching it with my lips, and spoke again. "Uncle, my boy," he answered. "It is of the utmost consequence that we should know how far we are asunder. That is not difficult. You have your chronometer at hand. Certainly, pronounce my name, noting exactly the second at which you speak. I will reply as soon as I hear your words, and you will then note exactly the moment at which my reply reaches you." "Very good. And the meantime between my question and your answer will be the time occupied by my voice in reaching you." "That is exactly what I mean, uncle," I replied. "Are you ready?" "Yes, make ready. I am about to pronounce your name." I applied my ear close to the sides of the cavernous gallery, and as soon as the word Harry reached my ear, I turned round and, placing my lips to the wall, repeated the sound. 40 seconds, said my uncle. There has elapsed 40 seconds. The sound, therefore, takes 20 seconds to ascend. Now, allowing 1,020 feet for every second, we have 20,400 feet, a league and a half and 1/8. These words fell on my soul like a kind of death knell. "A league and a half," I muttered in a low and despairing voice. "It shall be got over, my boy," cried my uncle in a cheery tone. "Depend on us. But do you know whether to ascend or descend?" I asked faintly enough. "We have to descend, and I will tell you why. You have reached a vast open space, a kind of bare crossroad, from which galleries diverge in every direction. That in which you are now lying must necessarily bring you to this point, for it appears that all these mighty fissures, these fractures of the globe's interior, radiate from the vast cavern which we at this moment occupy. Rouse yourself, then, have courage, and continue your route. Walk if you can. If not, drag yourself along, slide, if nothing else is possible. The slope must be rather rapid, and you will find strong arms to receive you at the end of your journey. Make a start, like a good fellow." These words served to rouse some kind of courage in my sinking frame. "Farewell for the present, good uncle. I am about to take my departure. As soon as I start, our voices will cease to commingle. Farewell then, until we meet again. Adieu, Harry, until we say welcome." Such were the last words which reached my anxious ears. Before I commenced my weary and almost hopeless journey, this wonderful and surprising conversation through the vast mass of the earth's labyrinth, these words exchanged. The speakers about 5 miles apart ended with hopeful and pleasant expressions. I breathed one more prayer to heaven. I sent up words of thanksgiving, believing in my inmost heart that he had led me to the only place where the voices of my friends could reach my ears. This astounding acoustic mystery is explainable by natural laws. It arose from the conductibility of the rock. There are many instances of this singular propagation of sound, not perceptible in its less immediate positions, in the interior gallery of St. Paul's, and amid the curious caverns in Sicily. These phenomena are observable. The most marvelous of them all is known as the ear of Dionysius. These memories of the past, of my early reading and studies, came fresh to my thoughts. Moreover, I began to reason that, if at such a distance we could communicate, no serious obstacle could exist. All I had to do was to follow the direction whence the sound had reached me. And logically putting it, I must reach him, if my strength did not fail. I accordingly rose to my feet. I soon found, however, that I could not walk. I must drag myself along. The slope, as I expected, was very rapid, but I allowed myself to slip down. Soon the rapidity of the descent began to assume frightful proportions, and menaced a fearful fall. I clutched at the sides. I grasped at projections of rocks. I threw myself backwards, all in vain. My weakness was so great I could do nothing to save myself. Suddenly earth failed me. I was first launched into a dark and gloomy void. I then struck against the projecting asperities of a vertical gallery, a perfect well. My head bounded against a pointed rock, and I lost all knowledge of existence. As far as I was concerned, death had claimed me for his own. When I returned to the consciousness of existence, I found myself surrounded by a kind of semi-obscurity, lying on some thick and soft coverlets. My uncle was watching, his eyes fixed intently on my countenance, a grave expression on his face, a tear in his eye. At the first sigh which struggled from my bosom, he took hold of my hand. When he saw my eyes open and fix themselves upon his, he uttered a loud cry of joy. "He lives! He lives! Yes, my good uncle," I whispered. "My dear boy," continued the grim professor, clasping me to his heart, "you are saved." I was deeply and unaffectedly touched by the tone in which these words were uttered, and even more by the kindly care which accompanied them. The professor, however, was one of those men who must be severely tried in order to induce any display of affection or gentle emotion. At this moment, our friend Hans, the guide, joined us. He saw my hand in that of my uncle, and taciturn as he was, his eyes beamed with lively satisfaction. "God dag," he said. "Good day, Hans, good day," I replied, in as hearty a tone as I could assume. "And now, uncle, that we are together, tell me where we are. I have lost all idea of our position, as of everything else." "Tomorrow, Harry, tomorrow," he replied. "Today you are far too weak. Your head is surrounded with bandages and poultices that must not be touched. Sleep, my boy, sleep, and tomorrow you will know all that you require." "But," I cried, "let me know what o'clock it is, what day it is." "It is now 11 o'clock at night, and this is once more Sunday. It is now the 9th of the month of August, and I distinctly prohibit you from asking any more questions until the 10th of the same." I was, if the truth were told, very weak indeed, and my eyes soon closed involuntarily. I did require a good night's rest, and I went off reflecting at the last moment that my perilous adventure in the interior of the earth, in total darkness, had lasted for days. On the morning of the next day, at my awakening, I began to look around me. My sleeping place, made of all our traveling bedding, was in a charming grotto, adorned with magnificent stalagmites, glittering in all the colors of the rainbow, the floor of soft and silvery sand. A dim obscurity prevailed. No torch, no lamp was lighted, and yet certain unexplained beams of light penetrated from without, and made their way through the opening of the beautiful grotto. I, moreover, heard a vague and indefinite murmur, like the ebb and flow of waves upon a strand. And sometimes I verily believed I could hear the sighing of the wind. I began to believe that, instead of being awake, I must be dreaming. Surely my brain had not been affected by my fall, and all that occurred during the last 24 hours was not the frenzied visions of madness. And yet, after some reflection, a trial of my faculties, I came to the conclusion that I could not be mistaken. Eyes and ears could not surely both deceive me. "It is a ray of the blessed daylight," I said to myself. which has penetrated through some mighty fissure in the rocks. But what is the meaning of this murmur of waves, this unmistakable moaning of the salt sea billows? I can hear, too, plainly enough, the whistling of the wind. But can I be altogether mistaken? If my uncle, during my illness, has but carried me back to the surface of the earth? Has he, on my account, given up his wondrous expedition, or in some strange manner has it come to an end? I was puzzling my brain over these and other questions, when the professor joined me. "Good day, Harry," he cried in a joyous tone. "I fancy you are quite well." "I am very much better," I replied, actually sitting up in my bed. I knew that would be the end of it, as you slept both soundly and tranquilly. Hans and I have each taken turn to watch, and every hour we have seen visible signs of a miracle. "You must be right, uncle," was my reply, "for I feel as if I could do justice to any meal you could put before me. You shall eat, my boy, you shall eat. The fever has left you. Our excellent friend Hans has rubbed your wounds and bruises with, I know not what ointment, of which the Icelanders alone possess the secret, and they have healed your bruises in the most marvelous manner. Ah, he's a wise fellow, is Master Hans." While he was speaking, my uncle was placing before me several articles of food, which I readily devoured. As soon as the first rage of hunger was appeased, I overwhelmed him with questions, to which he now no longer hesitated to give answers. I then learned, for the first time, that my providential fall had brought me to the bottom of an almost perpendicular gallery. As I came down, amidst a perfect shower of stones, the least of which falling on me would have crushed me to death, they came to the conclusion that I had carried with me an entire dislocated rock. Riding as it were on this terrible chariot, I was cast headlong into my uncle's arms, and into them I fell, insensible and covered with blood. "It is indeed a miracle," was the professor's final remark, "that you were not killed 1,000 times over. But let us take care never to separate, for surely we should risk never meeting again. Let us take care never again to separate." These words fell with a sort of chill upon my heart. The journey then was not over. I looked at my uncle with surprise and astonishment. My uncle, after an instant's examination of my countenance, said, "What is the matter, Harry? I want to ask you a very serious question. You say that I am all right in health. Certainly you are, and all my limbs are sound and capable of new exertion," I asked. "Most undoubtedly. But what about my head?" was my next anxious question. "Well, your head, except that you have 1 or 2 contusions, is exactly where it ought to be, on your shoulders," said my uncle, laughing. "Well, my own opinion is that my head is not exactly right. In fact, I believe myself slightly delirious." "What makes you think so?" "I will explain why I fancy I have lost my senses," I cried. "Have we not returned to the surface of Mother Earth?" "Certainly not." "Then truly I must be mad, for do I not see the light of day? Do I not hear the whistling of the wind? And can I not distinguish the wash of a great sea? And that is all that makes you uneasy," said my uncle with a smile. "Can you explain?" "I will not make any attempt to explain, for the whole matter is utterly inexplicable. But you shall see and judge for yourself. You will then find that geological science is as yet in its infancy, and that we are doomed to enlighten the world. Let us advance, then," I cried eagerly, no longer able to restrain my curiosity. "Wait a moment, my dear Harry," he responded. "You must take precautions after your illness before going into the open air." "The open air, yes, my boy. I have to warn you that the wind is rather violent, and I have no wish for you to expose yourself without necessary precautions. But I beg to assure you that I am perfectly recovered. Have just a little patience, my boy. A relapse would be inconvenient to all parties. We have no time to lose, as our approaching sea voyage may be of long duration." "Sea voyage?" I cried, more bewildered than ever. "Yes, you must take another day's rest, and we shall be ready to go on board by tomorrow," replied my uncle with a peculiar smile. "Go on board?" The words utterly astonished me. Go on board what and how? Had we come upon a river, a lake? Had we discovered some inland sea? Was a vessel lying at anchor in some part of the interior of the earth? My curiosity was worked up to the very highest pitch. My uncle made vain attempts to restrain me. At last he discovered that my feverish impatience would do more harm than good. and that the satisfaction of my wishes could alone restore me to a calm state of mind, he gave way. I dressed myself rapidly and, then taking the precaution to please my uncle, of wrapping myself in one of the coverlets, I rushed out of the grotto. At first, I saw absolutely nothing. My eyes, wholly unused to the effulgence of light, could not bear the sudden brightness, and I was compelled to close them. When I was able to reopen them, I stood still, far more stupefied than astonished. Not all the wildest effects of imagination could have conjured up such a scene. The sea, I cried. Yes, replied my uncle, in a tone of pardonable pride, the Central Sea. No future navigator will deny the fact of my having discovered it, and hence of acquiring a right of giving it a name. It was quite true. A vast, limitless expanse of water, the end of a lake, if not of an ocean, spread before us, until it was lost in the distance. The shore, very much indented, consisted of beautiful soft golden sand. It was mixed with small shells, the long deserted home of some of the creatures of a past age. The waves broke incessantly and, with a peculiarly sonorous murmur, to be found in underground localities. A slight frothy flake arose as the wind blew along the pellucid waters. Many a dash of spray was blown into my face. The mighty superstructure of rock, which rose above to an inconceivable height, left only a narrow opening but where we stood. There was a large margin of strand. On all sides were capes and promontories and enormous cliffs, partially worn by the eternal breaking of the waves, through countless ages. And as I gazed from side to side, the mighty rocks faded away like a fleecy film of cloud. It was in reality an ocean, with all the usual characteristics of an inland sea, only horribly wild, so rigid, cold, and savage. One thing startled and puzzled me greatly. How was it that I was able to look upon that vast sheet of water, instead of being plunged in utter darkness? The vast landscape before me was lit up like day, but there was wanting the splendid irradiation of the sun, the brightness of the stars. The pale, cold illumination of the moon was not there. The illuminating power in this subterranean region, from its trembling and flickering character, its clear, dry whiteness, its slight elevation of temperature, and its superiority to that of the moon, was evidently electric. It was something in the nature of the aurora borealis, only that its phenomena were constant, and able to light up the whole of the ocean cavern. The tremendous vault above our heads, the sky, so to speak, appeared composed of a conglomeration of nebulous vapors in constant motion. One should originally have supposed that, under such atmospheric pressure as must exist in that place, the evaporation of water could not take place, and yet from the action of some physical law there were heavy and dense clouds rolling along that mighty vault, partially concealing the roof. Electric currents produced astonishing play of light and shade in the distance, especially around the heavier clouds. Deep shadows were cast beneath, and then suddenly, between two clouds, there would come a ray of unusual beauty and remarkable intensity. And yet it was not like the sun, for it gave no heat. The effect was sad and excruciatingly melancholy. Instead of a noble firmament of blue, studded with stars, there was above me a heavy roof of granite, which seemed to crush me. Gazing around, I began to think of the theory of the English captain. He compared the earth to a vast hollow sphere in the interior of which the air is retained in a luminous state by means of atmospheric pressure, while two stars, Pluto and Proserpine, circled there in their mysterious orbits. After all, suppose the old fellow was right. In truth, we were imprisoned, bound, as it were, in a vast excavation. Its width it was impossible to make out. The shore on either hand widened rapidly until lost to sight. Its length was equally uncertain. A haze on the distant horizon bounded our view. As to its height, we could see that it must be many miles to the roof. Looking upward, it was impossible to discover where the stupendous roof began. The lowest of the clouds must have been floating at an elevation of 2,000 yards, owing to the extreme density of the air. I use the word cavern to give an idea of the place. I cannot describe its awful grandeur. Human language fails to convey an idea of its savage sublimity. Whether this singular vacuum had or had not been caused by the sudden cooling of the earth, I could not say. I had read of most wonderful and gigantic caverns, but none in any way like this. The great grotto of Guachara in Colombia, visited by the learned Humboldt. The vast and partially explored Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. What were these holes in the earth to that in which I stood, in speechless admiration, with its vapory clouds, its electric light, and the mighty ocean slumbering in its bosom? Imagination, not description, can alone give an idea of the splendor and vastness of the cave. I gazed at these marvels in profound silence. Words were utterly wanting. I seemed, as I stood upon that mysterious shore, as if I were some wandering inhabitant of a distant planet, present for the first time at the spectacle of terrestrial phenomena belonging to another existence. To give body to such new sensations would have required the coinage of new words. Here my feeble brain found itself wholly at fault. I looked on, I thought, I reflected, I admired, in a state of stupefaction not altogether unmingled with fear. The unexpected spectacle restored some color to my pallid cheeks. I seemed to be actually getting better. Moreover, the vivacity of the dense atmosphere reanimated my body by inflating my lungs with unaccustomed oxygen. It will be readily conceived that after an imprisonment of 47 days in a dark and miserable tunnel, it was with infinite delight that I breathed this saline air. It was like the genial, reviving influence of the salt sea waves. My uncle had already got over the first surprise. With the Latin poet Horace, his idea was that not to admire is all the art I know, to make man happy and to keep him so. Well, he said, after giving me time thoroughly to appreciate the marvels of this underground sea, do you feel strong enough to walk up and down? Certainly, was my ready answer. Nothing would give me greater pleasure. Well then, my boy, he said, lean on my arm, and we will stroll along the beach. I accepted his offer eagerly, and we began to walk along the shores of this extraordinary lake. To our left were abrupt rocks, piled one upon the other, stupendous titanic pile. Down their sides leaped innumerable cascades. At last, becoming limpid and murmuring streams, they were lost in the waters of the lake. Light vapors rose here and there, and floated in fleecy clouds from rock to rock, indicating hot springs, which also poured their superfluity into the vast reservoir at our feet. Among them I recognized our old and faithful stream, the Hansbach, which, lost in that wild basin, seemed as if it had been flowing since the creation of the world. We shall miss our excellent friend, I remarked, with a deep sigh. Bah, said my uncle testily. What matters it that or another? It is all the same. I thought the remark ungrateful, and felt almost inclined to say so. But I forbore. At this moment my attention was attracted by an unexpected spectacle. After we had gone about 500 yards, we turned a steep promontory. We found ourselves close to a lofty forest. It consisted of straight trunks with tufted tops, in shape like parasols. The air seemed to have no effect upon these trees which, in spite of a tolerable breeze, remained as still and motionless as if they had been petrified. I hastened forward. I could find no name for these singular formations. Did they not belong to the 2,000 and more known treesor? Were we to make the discovery of a new growth? By no means. When we at last reached the forest, my surprise gave way to admiration. In truth, I was simply in the presence of a very ordinary product of the earth, of singular and gigantic proportions. My uncle unhesitatingly called them by their real names. It is only, he said in his coolest manner, a forest of mushrooms. On close examination, I found that he was not mistaken. Judge of the development attained by this product of damp hot soils. I had heard that the Lycoperdon giganteum reaches 9 feet in circumference, but here were white mushrooms nearly 40 feet high, with tops of equal dimensions. They grew in countless thousands. The light could not make its way through their massive substance, and beneath them reigned a gloomy and mystic darkness. Still I wished to go forward. The cold in the shades of this singular forest was intense. For nearly an hour we wandered in visible darkness. At length I left the spot, and once more returned to the shores of the lake, to light and comparative warmth. But the amazing vegetation of subterraneous land was not confined to gigantic mushrooms. New wonders awaited us at every step. Soon we came upon a mighty group of other trees, with discolored leaves, the common humble trees of Mother Earth, of an exorbitant and phenomenal size, lycopods 100 feet high, flowering ferns as tall as pines, gigantic grasses, Astonishing, magnificent, splendid, cried my uncle. Here we have the flora of the second period. Behold the humble plants of our gardens, which in the first ages of the world were mighty trees. Look around you, my dear Harry. No botanist ever before gazed on such a sight. My uncle's enthusiasm, always a little more than was required, was now excusable. You are right, uncle, I remarked. Providence appears to have designed the preservation in this vast and mysterious hothouse of antediluvian plants, to prove the sagacity of learned men in figuring them so marvelously on paper. Well said, my boy, very well said. It is indeed a mighty hothouse, but you would also be within the bounds of reason and common sense if you added that it is also a vast menagerie. I looked rather anxiously around. If the animals were as exaggerated as the plants, the matter would certainly be serious. A menagerie. Doubtless. Look at the dust we are treading underfoot. Behold the bones with which the whole soil of the seashore is covered. Bones. I replied, yes, certainly, the bones of antediluvian animals. I stooped and picked up singular remains, relics of a bygone age. It was easy to give a name to these gigantic bones, in some instances, as big as trunks of trees. Here is, clearly, the lower jawbone of a mastodon, I cried. Here are the molars of the Deinotherium. Here is a leg bone which belonged to the Megatherium. You are right, uncle. It is indeed a menagerie. For the mighty animals to which these bones once belonged have lived and died on the shores of this subterranean sea, under the shadow of these plants. Look, yonder are whole skeletons, and yet, nephew, said my uncle, I do not understand the presence of such beasts in granite caverns, however vast and prodigious, was my reply. Why not, said my uncle, with very much of his old professional impatience. Because it is well known that animal life only existed on Earth during the secondary period, when the sedimentary soil was formed by the alluviums, and thus replaced the hot and burning rocks of the primitive age. I have listened to you earnestly and with patience, Harry, he said, and I have a simple and clear answer. This itself is a sedimentary soil. How can that be at such enormous depth from the surface of the Earth? The fact can be explained both simply and geologically. At a certain period, the Earth consisted only of an elastic crust, liable to upward and downward movements in virtue of the law of attraction. It is very probable that many a landslip took place in those days, and that large portions of sedimentary soil were cast into huge and mighty chasms. Quite possible, I dryly remarked. But uncle, if these antediluvian animals formerly lived in these subterranean regions, what then? What more likely than that one of these monsters may at this moment be concealed behind one of yonder mighty rocks? As I spoke, I looked keenly around, examining with care every point of the horizon, but nothing alive appeared to exist on these deserted shores. I now felt rather fatigued, and told my uncle so. The walk and excitement were too much for me in my weak state. I therefore seated myself at the end of a promontory, at the foot of which the waves broke in incessant rolls. I looked round a bay of vast granitic rocks. At the extreme end was a little port protected by huge pyramids of stones. A brig and 3 or 4 schooners might have lain there with perfect ease. So natural did it seem, that every minute I expected a vessel coming out under all sail and making for the open sea, under the influence of a warm southerly breeze. But the fantastic illusion never lasted more than a minute. We were the only living creatures in this subterranean world. During certain periods there was an utter cessation of wind, when a deeper silence fell upon the arid rocks. It seemed to hang like a leaden weight upon the waters of this singular ocean. I sought, amid the awful stillness, to penetrate through the distant fog, to tear down the veil which concealed the mysterious distance. What unspoken words were murmured by my trembling lips, what questions I wished to ask. Where did this sea end to? What did it lead? Should we ever be able to examine its distant shores? But my uncle had no doubts about the matter. He was convinced that our enterprise would in the end be successful. For my part, I was in a state of painful indecision. I desired to embark on the journey and to succeed, and still I feared the result. After we had passed an hour or more in silent contemplation of the wondrous spectacle, we rose and went down towards the bank on our way to the grotto, which I was not sorry to gain. After a slight repast, I sought refuge in slumber, and at length, after many and tedious struggles, Sleep came over my weary eyes. On the morning of the next day, to my great surprise, I awoke completely restored. I thought a bath would be delightful after my long illness and sufferings. So, soon after rising, I went and plunged into the waters of this new Mediterranean. The bath was cool, fresh, and invigorating. I came back to breakfast with an excellent appetite. Hans, our worthy guide, thoroughly understood how to cook such eatables as we were able to provide. He had both fire and water at discretion, so that he was enabled slightly to vary the weary monotony of our ordinary repast. Our morning meal was like a capital English breakfast, with coffee by way of a wind-up, and never had this delicious beverage been so welcome and refreshing. My uncle had sufficient regard for my state of health not to interrupt me in the enjoyment of the meal, but he was evidently delighted when I had finished. "Now then," said he, "come with me. It is the height of the tide, and I am anxious to study its curious phenomena." "What?" I cried, rising in astonishment. "Did you say the tide, uncle?" "Certainly I did. You do not mean to say," I replied, in a tone of respectful doubt, "that the influence of the sun and moon is felt here below? And pray, why not? Are not all bodies influenced by the law of universal attraction? Why should this vast underground sea be exempt from the general law, the rule of the universe? Besides, there is nothing like that which is proved and demonstrated. Despite the great atmospheric pressure down here, you will notice that this inland sea rises and falls with as much regularity as the Atlantic itself." As my uncle spoke, we reached the sandy shore, and saw and heard the waves breaking monotonously on the beach. They were evidently rising. "This is truly the flood," I cried, looking at the water at my feet. "Yes, my excellent nephew," replied my uncle, rubbing his hands with the gusto of a philosopher. "And you see by these streaks of foam, the tide rises 10 or 12 feet. It is indeed marvelous." "By no means," he responded. "On the contrary, it is quite natural. It may appear so in your eyes." "My dear uncle," was my reply, "but all the phenomena of the place appear to me to partake of the marvelous. It is almost impossible to believe that which I see. Who in his wildest dreams could have imagined that, beneath the crust of our earth, there could exist a real ocean, with ebbing and flowing tides, with its changes of winds, and even its storms? I for one should have laughed the suggestion to scorn." "But, Harry, my boy, why not?" inquired my uncle, with a pitying smile. "Is there any physical reason in opposition to it?" "Well, if we give up the great theory of the central heat of the earth, I certainly can offer no reasons why anything should be looked upon as impossible. Then you will own," he added, "that the system of Sir Humphrey Davy is wholly justified by what we have seen." "I allow that it is," I answered, "and that point once granted, I certainly can see no reason for doubting the existence of seas and other wonders, even countries, in the interior of the globe. That is so, but of course, these varied countries are uninhabited." "Well, I grant that it is more likely than not. Still, I do not see why this sea should not have given shelter to some species of unknown fish. Hitherto we have not discovered any, and the probabilities are rather against our ever doing so," observed the professor. I was losing my skepticism in the presence of these wonders. "Well, I am determined to solve the question. It is my intention to try my luck with my fishing line and hook." "Certainly, make the experiment," said my uncle, pleased with my enthusiasm. "It will be proper to discover all the secrets of this extraordinary region. But, after all, where are we now?" I asked. "All this time I have quite forgotten to ask you a question, which, doubtless, your philosophical instruments have long since answered." "Well," replied the professor, "from one point of view, we are 350 leagues from Iceland." "So much?" was my exclamation. "I have gone over the matter several times, and am sure not to have made a mistake of 500 yards, replied my uncle positively. "And as to the direction, are we still going to the southeast?" "Yes, with a western declination of 19 degrees, 42 minutes, just as it is above. As for the inclination, I have discovered a very curious fact." "What may that be, uncle? Your information interests me." "Why, that the needle instead of dipping towards the pole has an upward tendency." "This proves," I cried, "that the great point of magnetic attraction lies somewhere between the surface of the earth and the spot we have succeeded in reaching." "Exactly," My observant nephew, exclaimed my uncle, elated and delighted, and it is quite probable that if we succeed in getting toward the polar regions somewhere near the 73rd degree of latitude, where Sir James Ross discovered the magnetic pole, we shall behold the needle point directly upward. We have therefore discovered by analogy that this great center of attraction is not very deep. Well, said I, rather surprised, this discovery will astonish experimental philosophers. It was never suspected. Science, great, mighty, and in the end unerring, replied my uncle dogmatically, has fallen into many errors. They're as fortunate and useful as stepping stones to truth. After some further discussion, I turned to another matter. Have you any idea of the depth we have reached? We are now, continued the professor, exactly 35 leagues above, 100 miles down into the interior of the earth. So, said I, after measuring the distance on the map, we are now beneath the Scottish Highlands, and have over our heads the lofty Grampian Hills. You are quite right, said the professor, laughing. It sounds very alarming, the weight being heavy, but the vault is solid and safe. The mighty architect of the universe has constructed it of solid materials. Man, even in his highest flights of imagination, never thought of such things. What are the finest arches of our bridges, what the vaulted roofs of our cathedrals, to that mighty dome above us, and beneath which floats an ocean with its storms and calms and tides. I admire it all as much as you can, uncle, and have no fear that our granite sky will fall upon our heads. But now, what are your future intentions? Are you not thinking of getting back to the surface? This was said more as a feeler than with any hope of success. Go back, nephew, cried my uncle in a tone of alarm. You are not surely thinking of anything so absurd or cowardly. No, my intention is to advance and continue our journey. We have as yet been singularly fortunate, and henceforth I hope we shall be more so. But, said I, how are we to cross yonder liquid plain? It is not my intention to leap into it, head foremost, or even to swim across it, like Leander over the Hellespont. But as oceans are, after all, only great lakes, inasmuch as they are surrounded by land, so does it stand to reason that this central sea is circumscribed by granite surroundings. Doubtless, was my natural reply. Well then, do you not think that once we reach the other end, we shall find some means of continuing our journey? Probably, but what extent do you allow to this internal ocean? Well, I should fancy it to extend about 40 or 50 leagues, more or less. But even supposing this approximation to be a correct one, what then? My dear boy, we have no time for further discussion. We shall embark tomorrow. I looked around with surprise and incredulity. I could see nothing in the shape of boat or vessel. What? I cried. We are about to launch out upon an unknown sea. And where is the vessel? Well, my dear boy, it will not be exactly what you would call a vessel. For the present we must be content with a good and solid raft. A raft? I cried, incredulously. But down here a raft is as impossible of construction as a vessel, and I am at a loss to imagine. My good Harry, if you were to listen instead of talking so much, you would hear, said my uncle, waxing a little impatient. I should hear. Yes, Sir Knox with the hammer, which Hans is now employing to make the raft. He has been at work for many hours, making a raft, yes. But where has he found trees suitable for such a construction? He found the trees all ready to his hand. Come, and you shall see our excellent guide at work. More and more amazed at what I heard and saw, I followed my uncle like one in a dream. After a walk of about a quarter of an hour, I saw Hans at work on the other side of the promontory, which formed our natural port. A few minutes more, and I was beside him. To my great surprise, on the sandy shore lay a half-finished raft. It was made from beams of a very peculiar wood, and a great number of limbs, joints, bows, and pieces lay about, sufficient to have constructed a fleet of ships and boats. I turned to my uncle, silent with astonishment and awe. Where did all this wood come from? What wood is it? Well, there is pine wood, fir, and the palms of the northern regions, mineralized by the action of the sea, he replied sententiously. Can it be possible? Yes, said the learned professor. What you see is called fossil wood. But then, cried I, after reflecting for a moment, like the lignites, it must be as hard and as heavy as iron, and therefore will certainly not float. sometimes that is the case. Many of these woods have become true anthracites, but others again have only undergone one phase of fossil transformation, but there is no proof like demonstration, added my uncle, picking one or two of these precious waifs and casting them into the sea. The piece of wood, after having disappeared for a moment, came to the surface and floated with wind and tide. "Are you convinced?" said my uncle with a self-satisfied smile. "I am convinced," I cried, "that what I see is incredible." The fact was that my journey into the interior of the earth was rapidly changing all preconceived notions, preparing me day by day for the marvelous. I should not have been surprised to have seen a fleet of native canoes afloat upon that silent sea. The very next evening, thanks to the industry and ability of Hans, the raft was finished. It was about 10 feet long and 5 feet wide. The beams, bound together with stout ropes, were solid and firm, and once launched by our united efforts, the improvised vessel floated tranquilly upon the waters of what the professor had well named the Central Sea. On the 13th of August, we were up betimes. There was no time to be lost. We now had to inaugurate a new kind of locomotion, which would have the advantage of being rapid and not fatiguing. A mast, made of 2 pieces of wood fastened together, to give additional strength, a yard made from another one, the sail a linen sheet from our bed. We were fortunately in no want of cordage, and the whole on trial appeared solid and seaworthy. At 6 o'clock in the morning, when the eager and enthusiastic professor gave the signal to embark, the victuals, the luggage, all our instruments, our weapons, and a goodly supply of sweet water, which we had collected from springs in the rocks, were placed on the raft. Hans had, with considerable ingenuity, contrived a rudder, which enabled him to guide the floating apparatus with ease. He took the tiller, as a matter of course. The worthy man was as good a sailor as he was a guide and duck hunter. I then let go the painter which held us to the shore. The sail was brought to the wind, and we made a rapid offing. Our sea voyage had at length commenced, and once more we were making for distant and unknown regions. Just as we were about to leave the little port where the raft had been constructed, my uncle, who was very strong as to geographic nomenclature, wanted to give it a name, and among others, suggested mine. "Well," said I, "before you decide, I have another to propose." "Well, out with it. I should like to call it Gretchen. Port Gretchen will sound very well on our future map." "Well then, Port Gretchen let it be," said the professor. And thus the memory of my dear girl was attached to our adventurous expedition. When we left the shore, the wind was blowing from the northward and eastward. We went directly before the wind at a much greater speed than might have been expected from a raft. The dense layers of atmosphere at that depth had great propelling power. They acted upon the sail with considerable force. At the end of an hour, my uncle, who had been taking careful observations, was enabled to judge of the rapidity with which we moved. It was far beyond anything seen in the upper world. "If," he said, "we continue to advance at our present rate, we shall have traveled at least 30 leagues in 24 hours. With a mere raft, this is an almost incredible velocity." I certainly was surprised, and without making any reply, went forward upon the raft. Already the northern shore was fading away on the edge of the horizon. The 2 shores appeared to separate more and more, leaving a wide and open space for our departure. Before me I could see nothing but the vast and apparently limitless sea upon which we floated. We were the only living objects in sight. Huge and dark clouds cast their gray shadows, the low shadows which seemed to crush that colorless and sullen water by their weight. Anything more suggestive of gloom and of regions of nether darkness I never beheld. Silvery rays of electric light, reflected here and there upon some small spots of water, brought up luminous sparkles in the long wake of our cumbrous bark. Presently we were wholly out of sight of land. Not a vestige could be seen, nor any indication of where we were going. So still and motionless did we seem, without any distant point to fix our eyes on that but for the phosphoric light at the wake of the raft. I should have fancied that we were still and motionless. But I knew that we were advancing at a very rapid rate. About 12 o'clock in the day, vast collections of seaweed were discovered surrounding us on all sides. I was aware of the extraordinary vegetative power of these plants, which have been known to creep along the bottom of the great ocean and stop the advance of large ships. But never were seaweeds ever seen, so gigantic and wonderful as those of the Central Sea. I could well imagine how, seen at a distance, tossing and heaving on the summit of the billows, the long lines of algae have been taken for living things, fertile sources of belief in sea serpents. Our raft swept past great specimens of fucus or sea wrack, from 3,000 to 4,000 feet in length, immense, incredibly long, looking like snakes that stretched out far beyond our horizon. It afforded me great amusement to gaze on their variegated ribbon-like, endless lengths. Hour after hour passed without our coming to the termination of these floating weeds. If my astonishment increased, my patience was well nigh exhausted. What natural force could possibly have produced such abnormal and extraordinary plants? What must have been the aspect of the globe during the first centuries of its formation, when under the combined action of heat and humidity, the vegetable kingdom occupied its vast surface to the exclusion of everything else? These were considerations of never-ending interest for the geologist and the philosopher. All this while we were advancing on our journey, and at length night came. But as I had remarked the evening before, the luminous state of the atmosphere was in nothing diminished. Whatever was the cause, it was a phenomenon on whose duration we could calculate. As soon as our supper had been disposed of, and some little speculative conversation indulged in, I stretched myself at the foot of the mast, and presently went to sleep. Hans remained motionless at the tiller, allowing the raft to rise and fall on the waves. The wind being aft, and the sail square, all he had to do was to keep his oar in the center. Ever since we had taken our departure from the newly named Port Gretchen, my worthy uncle had directed me to keep a regular log of our day's navigation. He gave instructions to put down even the most minute particulars, every interesting and curious phenomenon, the direction of the wind, our rate of sailing, the distance we went, in a word, every incident of our extraordinary voyage. From our log, therefore, I tell the story of our voyage on the Central Sea. Friday, August 14th, a steady breeze from the northwest, raft progressing with extreme rapidity, and going perfectly straight. Coast still dimly visible about 30 leagues to leeward, nothing to be seen beyond the horizon in front. The extraordinary intensity of the light neither increases nor diminishes. It is singularly stationary. The weather remarkably fine, that is to say, the clouds have ascended very high, and are light and fleecy, and surrounded by an atmosphere resembling silver infusion. Thermometer, plus 32 degrees centigrade. About 12 o'clock in the day, our guide, Hans, having prepared and baited a hook, cast his line into the subterranean waters. The bait he used was a small piece of meat, by means of which he concealed his hook. Anxious as I was for a long time doomed to disappointment. Were these waters supplied with fish or not? That was the important question. No was my decided answer. Then there came a sudden and rather hard tug. Hans coolly drew it in, and with it a fish, which struggled violently to escape. "A fish?" cried my uncle. "It is a sturgeon," I cried. "Certainly a small sturgeon." The professor examined the fish carefully, noting every characteristic, and he did not coincide in my opinion. The fish had a flat head, round body, and the lower extremities covered with bony scales. Its mouth was wholly without teeth. The pectoral fins, which were highly developed, sprouted direct from the body, which properly speaking had no tail. The animal certainly belonged to the order in which naturalists class the sturgeon, but it differed in essential particulars. My uncle, after all, was not mistaken. After a long and patient examination, he said, "This fish, my dear boy, belongs to a family which has been extinct for ages, and of which no trace has ever been found on Earth, except fossil remains in the Devonian strata." "You do not mean to say," I cried, "that we have captured a live specimen of a fish belonging to the primitive stock that existed before the deluge?" "We have," said the professor, continuing his observations, "and you may see by careful examination that these fossil fish have no identity with existing species. To hold in one's hand, therefore, a living specimen of the order, is enough to make a naturalist happy for life." "But," cried I, "to what family does it belong?" "To the order of Ganoidsen, order of fish having angular scales, covered with bright enamel, forming one of the family of the cephalaspides of the genus." "Well, sir," I remarked, as I noticed my uncle hesitated to conclude, "to the genus Turritidicius, I am certain of it. Still, though I am confident of my surmise, this fish offers to our notice a remarkable peculiarity, never known to exist in any other fish, but those which are the natives of subterranean waters, wells, lakes, and caverns, and such like hidden pools. And what may that be? It is blind, blind, I cried, much surprised. Not only blind, continued the professor, but absolutely without organs of sight. I now examined our discovery for myself. It was singular, to be sure, but it was really a fact. This, however, might be a solitary instance, I suggested. The hook was baited again and thrown in. This subterranean ocean must have been tolerably well supplied with fish, for in 2 hours we took a large number of Pterichtis, as well as other fish belonging to another supposed extinct family, the Dipterides, though my uncle could not class it exactly. All, without exception, were blind. This unexpected capture enabled us to renew our stock of provisions in a very satisfactory way. We were now convinced that this subterranean sea contained only fish known to us as fossil specimens, and fish and reptiles alike were all the more perfect the farther back they dated their origin. We began to hope that we should find some of those saurians which science has succeeded in reconstructing from bits of bone or cartilage. I took up the telescope and carefully examined the horizon, looked over the whole sea. It was utterly and entirely deserted. Doubtless we were still too near the coast. After an examination of the ocean, I looked upward, towards the strange and mysterious sky. Why should not one of the birds reconstructed by the immortal Cuvier flap his stupendous wings aloft in the dull strata of subterranean air? It would, of course, find quite sufficient food from the fish in the sea. I gazed for some time upon the void above. It was as silent and as deserted as the shores we had but lately left. Nevertheless, though I could neither see nor discover anything, my imagination carried me away, into wild hypotheses. I was in a kind of waking dream. I thought I saw on the surface of the water those enormous antediluvian turtles as big as floating islands. Upon those dull and somber shores, passed a spectral row of the mammifers of early days. The great Leptotherium found in the cavernous hollow of the Brazilian hills. The Masicatherium, a native of the glacial regions of Siberia. Farther on, the Pachydermatous Lafrodon, that gigantic tapir, concealed itself behind rocks, ready to do battle with the a singular animal partaking of the nature of the rhinoceros, the horse, the hippopotamus, and the camel. There was the giant mastodon, twisting and turning his horrid trunk, with which he crushed the rocks of the shore to powder, while the Megatherium, his back raised like a cat in a passion, his enormous claws stretched out, dug into the earth for food, at the same time that he awoke the sonorous echoes of the whole place with his terrible roar. Higher up still, the first monkey ever seen on the face of the globe clambered up the granite hills. Still farther away ran the pterodactyl, with the winged hand, gliding or rather sailing through the dense and compressed air like a huge bat. Above all, near the leaden granitic sky, were immense birds, more powerful than the cassowary and the ostrich. They spread their mighty wings and fluttered against the huge stone vault of the inland sea. I thought, such was the effect of my imagination, that I saw this whole tribe of antediluvian creatures. I carried myself back to far ages, long before man existed, when, in fact, the earth was in too imperfect a state for him to live upon it. My dream was of countless ages before the existence of man. The mammifers first disappeared, then the mighty birds, then the reptiles of the secondary period, presently the fish, the crustacea, the mollusks, and finally, the vertebrata. The zoophytes of the period of transition in their turn sank into annihilation. The whole panorama of the world's life before the historic period seemed to be born over again, and mine was the only human heart that beat in this unpeopled world. There were no more seasons. There were no more climates. The natural heat of the world increased unceasingly, and neutralized that of the great radiant sun. Vegetation was exaggerated in an extraordinary manner. I passed like a shadow in the midst of brushwood, as lofty as the giant trees of California, and trod underfoot the moist and humid soil, reeking with a rank and varied vegetation. I leaned against the huge column-like trunks of giant trees, to which those of Canada were as ferns. Whole ages passed, hundreds upon hundreds of years concentrated into a single day. Next, Unrolled before me like a panorama came the great and wondrous series of terrestrial transformations. Plants disappeared. The granitic rocks lost all trace of solidity. The liquid state was suddenly substituted for that which had before existed. This was caused by intense heat acting on the organic matter of the earth. The waters flowed over the whole surface of the globe. They boiled, they were volatilized, or turned into vapor. A kind of steam cloud wrapped the whole earth, the globe itself becoming at last one huge sphere of gas, indescribable in color, between white heat and red, as big and as brilliant as the sun. In the very center of this prodigious mass, 1,400,000 times as large as our globe, I was whirled round in space, and brought into close conjunction with the planets. My body was subtilized, or rather became volatile, and commingled in a state of atomic vapor, with the prodigious clouds, which rushed forward like a mighty comet into infinite space. What an extraordinary dream! Where would it finally take me? My feverish hand began to write down the marvelous details. Details more like the imaginings of a lunatic than anything sober and real. I had during this period of hallucination forgotten everything: the professor, the guide, and the raft on which we were floating. My mind was in "What is the matter, Harry?" said my uncle suddenly. My eyes, which were wide opened like those of a somnambulist, were fixed upon him, but I did not see him, nor could I clearly make out anything around me. "Take care, my boy," again cried my uncle. "You will fall into the sea." As he uttered these words, I felt myself seized on the other side by the firm hand of our devoted guide. Had it not been for the presence of mind of Hans, I must infallibly have fallen into the waves and been drowned. "Have you gone mad?" cried my uncle, shaking me. What is the matter?" I said at last, coming to myself. "Are you ill, Henry?" continued the professor in an anxious tone. No, but I have had an extraordinary dream. It, however, has passed away. All now seems well," I added, looking around me with puzzled eyes. "All right," said my uncle. "A beautiful breeze, a splendid sea. We are going along at a rapid rate, and if I am not out in my calculations, we shall soon see land. I shall not be sorry to exchange the narrow limits of our raft for the mysterious strand of the subterranean ocean." As my uncle uttered these words, I rose and carefully scanned the horizon. But the line of water was still confounded with the lowering clouds that hung aloft, and in the distance appeared to touch the edge of the water. Saturday, August 15th. The sea still retains its uniform monotony. The same leaden hue, the same eternal glare from above. No indication of land being in sight. The horizon appears to retreat before us, more and more as we advance. My head, still dull and heavy from the effects of my extraordinary dream, which I cannot as yet banish from my mind. The professor, who has not dreamed, is, however, in one of his morose and unaccountable humors, spends his time in scanning the horizon, at every point of the compass. His telescope is raised every moment to his eyes, and when he finds nothing to give any clue to our whereabouts, he assumes a Napoleonic attitude and walks anxiously. I remarked that my uncle, the professor, had a strong tendency to resume his old impatient character, and I could not but make a note of this disagreeable circumstance in my journal. I saw clearly that it had required all the influence of my danger and suffering to extract from him one scintillation of humane feeling. Now that I was quite recovered, his original nature had conquered and obtained the upper hand. And, after all, what had he to be angry and annoyed about, now more than at any other time? Was not the journey being accomplished under the most favorable circumstances? Was not the raft progressing with the most marvelous rapidity? What then could be the matter? After one or two preliminary hems, I determined to inquire. "You seem uneasy, uncle," said I, when for about the 100th time he put down his telescope and walked up and down, muttering to himself. "No, I am not uneasy," he replied in a dry, harsh tone. "By no means." "Perhaps I should have said impatient," I replied, softening the force of my remark. "Enough to make me so, I think. And yet we are advancing at a rate seldom attained by a raft," I remarked. "What matters that?" cried my uncle. "I am not vexed at the rate we go at, but I am annoyed to find the sea so much faster than I expected." I then recollected that the professor, before our departure, had estimated the length of this subterranean ocean as at most about 30 leagues. Now we had traveled at least over thrice that distance, without discovering any trace of the distant shore. I began to understand my uncle's anger. "We are not going down," suddenly exclaimed the professor. "We are not progressing with our great discoveries. All this is utter loss of time. After all, I did not come from home to undertake a party of pleasure. This voyage on a raft over a pond annoys and wearies me." He called this adventurous journey a party of pleasure, and this great inland sea a pond. "But," argued I, "if we have followed the route indicated by the great Saknussemm, we cannot be going far wrong. That is the question, as the great, the immortal Shakespeare, has it. Are we following the route indicated by that wondrous sage? Did Saknussemm ever fall in with this great sheet of water? If he did he cross it? I begin to fear that the rivulet we adopted for a guide has led us wrong. In any case, we can never regret having come thus far. It is worth the whole journey to have enjoyed this magnificent spectacle. It is something to have seen. I care nothing about seeing, nor about magnificent spectacles. I came down into the interior of the earth with an object, and that object I mean to attain. Don't talk to me about admiring scenery, or any other sentimental trash." After this, I thought it well to hold my tongue, and allow the professor to bite his lips until the blood came, without further remark. At 6 o'clock in the evening, our matter-of-fact guide, Hans, asked for his week's salary, and receiving his 3 Rixdollars, put them carefully in his pocket. He was perfectly contented and satisfied. Sunday, August 16th. Nothing new to record. The same weather as before. The wind has a slight tendency to freshen up, with signs of an approaching gale. When I awoke, my first observation was in regard to the intensity of the light. I keep on fearing, day after day, that the extraordinary electric phenomenon should become first obscured, and then go wholly out, leaving us in total darkness. Nothing, however, of the kind occurs. The shadow of the raft, its mast and sails, is clearly distinguished on the surface of the water. This wondrous sea is, after all, infinite in its extent. It must be quite as wide as the Mediterranean or, perhaps even as the great Atlantic Ocean. Why, after all, should it not be so? My uncle has on more than one occasion tried deep-sea soundings. He tied the cross of one of our heaviest crowbars to the extremity of a cord, which he allowed to run out to the extent of 200 fathoms. We had the greatest difficulty in hoisting, in our novel kind of lead. When the crowbar was finally dragged on board, Hans called my attention to some singular marks upon its surface. The piece of iron looked as if it had been crushed between 2 very hard substances. I looked at our worthy guide with an inquiring glance. "Tander," said he. Of course, I was at a loss to understand. I turned round towards my uncle, absorbed in gloomy reflections. I had little wish to disturb him from his reverie. I accordingly turned once more towards our worthy Icelander. Hans very quietly and significantly opened his mouth once or twice, as if in the act of biting, and in this way made me understand his meaning. "Teeth?" cried I with stupefaction, as I examined the bar of iron. "Yes, there can be no doubt about the matter. The indentations on the bar of iron are the marks of teeth. What jaws must the owner of such molars be possessed of? Have we, then, come upon a monster of unknown species, which still exists within the vast waste of waters? A monster more voracious than a shark, more terrible and bulky than the whale. I am unable to withdraw my eyes from the bar of iron, actually half crushed. Is, then, my dream about to come true, a dread and terrible reality?" All day my thoughts were bent upon these speculations, and my imagination scarcely regained a degree of calmness and power of reflection until after a sleep of many hours. This day, as on other Sundays, we observed as a day of rest and pious meditation. Monday, August 17th. I have been trying to realize from memory the particular instincts of those antediluvian animals of the secondary period, which succeeding to the mollusca, to the crustacea and to the fish, preceded the appearance of the race of mammoth. The generation of reptiles then reigned supreme upon the earth. These hideous monsters ruled everything in the seas of the secondary period, which form the strata of which the Jura Mountains are composed. Nature had endowed them with perfect organization. What a gigantic structure was theirs! What vast and prodigious strength they possessed! The existing saurians, which include all such reptiles as lizards, crocodiles, and alligators, even the largest and most formidable of their class, are but feeble imitations of their mighty sires, the animals of ages long ago. If there were giants in the days of old, there were also gigantic animals. I shuddered as I evolved from my mind the idea and recollection of these awful monsters. No eye of man had seen them in the flesh. They took their walks abroad upon the face of the earth thousands of ages before man came into existence, and their fossil bones, discovered in the limestone, have allowed us to reconstruct them anatomically, and thus to get some faint idea of their colossal formation. I recollect once seeing in the Great Museum of Hamburg the skeleton of one of these wonderful saurians. It measured no less than 30 feet from the nose to the tail. Am I, then, an inhabitant of the earth of the present day, destined to find myself face to face with a representative of this antediluvian family? I can scarcely believe it possible. I can hardly believe it true. And yet these marks of powerful teeth upon the bar of iron, can there be a doubt from their shape that the bite is the bite of a crocodile? My eyes stare wildly and with terror upon the subterranean sea. Every moment I expect one of these monsters to rise from its vast cavernous depths. I fancy that the worthy professor in some measure shares my notions, if not my fears, for, after an attentive examination of the crowbar, he cast his eyes rapidly over the mighty and mysterious ocean. What could possess him to leave the land, I thought, as if the depth of this water was of any importance to us. No doubt he has disturbed some terrible monster in his watery home, and perhaps we may pay dearly for our temerity. Anxious to be prepared for the worst, I examined our weapons, and saw that they were in a fit state for use. My uncle looked on at me and nodded his head approvingly. He, too, has noticed what we have to fear. Already the uplifting of the waters on the surface indicates that something is in motion below. The danger approaches, it comes nearer and nearer. It behooves us to be on the watch. Tuesday, August 18th. Evening came at last, the hour when the desire for sleep caused our eyelids to be heavy. Night there is not, properly speaking, in this place, any more than there is in summer in the Arctic regions. Hans, however, is immovable at the rudder. When he snatches a moment of rest, I really cannot say. I take advantage of his vigilance to take some little repose. But 2 hours after, I was awakened from a heavy sleep by an awful shock. The raft appeared to have struck upon a sunken rock. It was lifted right out of the water by some wondrous and mysterious power, and then started off 20 fathoms distant. "Eh, what is it?" cried my uncle, starting up. "Are we shipwrecked or what?" Hans raised his hand and pointed to where, about 200 yards off, a large black mass was moving up and down. I looked with awe. My worst fears were realized. "It is a colossal monster," I cried, clasping my hands. "Yes," cried the agitated professor, "and there yonder is a huge sea lizard of terrible size and shape, and farther on, behold a prodigious crocodile. Look at his hideous jaws, and that row of monstrous teeth. Huh, he has gone." "A whale, a whale," shouted the professor. "I can see her enormous fins. See, how she blows air and water." 2 liquid columns rose to a vast height above the level of the sea, into which they fell with a terrific crash, waking up the echoes of that awful place. We stood still, surprised, stupefied, terror-stricken at the sight of this group of fearful marine monsters, more hideous in the reality than in my dream. They were of supernatural dimensions. The very smallest of the whole party could have crushed our raft with a single bite. Hans, seizing the rudder which had flown out of his hand, puts it hard aweather in order to escape from such dangerous vicinity. But no sooner does he do so, than he finds he is flying from Scylla to Charybdis. To leeward is a turtle about 40 feet wide, and a serpent quite as long, with an enormous and hideous head peering from out the waters. Look which way we will, it is impossible for us to fly. The fearful reptiles advanced upon us. They turned and twisted about the raft with awful rapidity. They formed around our devoted vessel a series of concentric circles. I took up my rifle in desperation. But what effect can a rifle ball produce upon the armor scales with which the bodies of these horrid monsters are covered? We remain still and dumb from utter horror. They advance upon us, nearer and nearer. Our fate appears certain, fearful and terrible. On one side the mighty crocodile, on the other, the great sea serpent. The rest of the fearful crowd of marine prodigies have plunged beneath the briny waves and disappeared. I am about to fire at any risk and try the effect of a shot. Hans, however, interfered by a sign to check me. The two hideous and ravenous monsters passed within 50 fathoms of the raft, and then made a rush at one another, their fury preventing them from seeing us. The combat commenced. We distinctly made out every action of the two hideous monsters. But to my excited imagination, the other animals appeared about to take part in the fierce and deadly struggle. The monster, the whale, the lizard, and the turtle. I distinctly saw them every moment. I pointed them out to the Icelander, but he only shook his head. TVA, he said. What two only does he say? Surely he is mistaken, I cried in a tone of wonder. He is quite right, replied my uncle coolly and philosophically, examining the terrible duel with his telescope, and speaking as if he were in a lecture room. How can that be? Yes, it is so. The first of these hideous monsters has the snout of a porpoise, the head of a lizard, the teeth of a crocodile, and it is this that has deceived us. It is the most fearful of all antediluvian reptiles, the world-renowned ichthyosaurus, or great fish lizard, and the other is a monstrous serpent, concealed under the hard vaulted shell of the turtle, the terrible enemy of its fearful rival, the plesiosaurus, or sea crocodile. Hans was quite right. The two monsters only disturbed the surface of the sea. At last have mortal eyes gazed upon two reptiles of the great primitive ocean. I see the flaming red eyes of the ichthyosaurus, each as big, or bigger than a man's head. Nature in its infinite wisdom had gifted this wondrous marine animal with an optical apparatus of extreme power, capable of resisting the pressure of the heavy layers of water which rolled over him in the depths of the ocean where he usually fed. It has by some authors truly been called the whale of the saurian race, for it is as big and quick in its motions as our king of the seas. This one measures not less than 100 feet in length, and I can form some idea of his girth when I see him lift his prodigious tail out of the waters. His jaw is of awful size and strength, and according to the best informed naturalists, it does not contain less than 182 teeth. The other was the mighty plesiosaurus, a serpent with a cylindrical trunk, with a short stumpy tail, with fins like a bank of oars in a Roman galley, its whole body covered by a carapace or shell, and its neck, as flexible as that of a swan, rose more than 30 feet above the waves, a tower of animated flesh. These animals attacked one another with inconceivable fury. Such a combat was never seen before by mortal eyes, and to us who did see it, it appeared more like the phantasmagoric creation of a dream than anything else. They raised mountains of water, which dashed in spray over the raft, already tossed to and fro by the waves. 20 times we seemed on the point of being upset and hurled headlong into the waves. Hideous hisses appeared to shake the gloomy granite roof of that mighty cavern, hisses, which carried terror to our hearts. The awful combatants held each other in a tight embrace. I could not make out one from the other. Still, the combat could not last forever, and woe unto us, whichsoever became the victor. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours passed away, without any decisive result. The struggle continued with the same deadly tenacity, but without apparent results. The deadly opponents now approached, now drew away from the raft. Once or twice we fancied they were about to leave us altogether, but instead of that, they came nearer and nearer. We crouched on the raft, ready to fire at them at a moment's notice, poor as the prospect of hurting or terrifying them was. Still, we were determined not to perish without a struggle. Suddenly the ichthyosaurus and the plesiosaurus disappeared beneath the waves, leaving behind them a maelstrom in the midst of the sea. We were nearly drawn down by the indraft of the water. Several minutes elapsed before anything was again seen. Was this wonderful combat to end in the depths of the ocean? Was the last act of this terrible drama to take place without spectators? It was impossible for us to say. Suddenly, at no great distance from us, an enormous mass rises out of the waters, the head of the great plesio. The terrible monster is now wounded unto death. I can see nothing now of his enormous body. All that could be distinguished was his serpent-like neck, which he twisted and curled in all the agonies of death. Now he struck the waters with it like a gigantic whip, and then again wriggled like a worm cut in two. The water was spurted up to a great distance in all directions. A great portion of it swept over our raft and nearly blinded us. But soon the end of the beast approached nearer and nearer. His movements slackened visibly. His contortions almost ceased. And at last the body of the mighty snake lay an inert, dead mass on the surface of the now calm and placid waters. As for the ichthyosaurus, has he gone down to his mighty cavern under the sea to rest, or will he reappear to destroy us? This question remained unanswered, and we had breathing time. Wednesday, August 19th. Fortunately, the wind, which for the present blows with some violence, has allowed us to escape from the scene of the unparalleled and extraordinary struggle. Hans, with his usual imperturbable calm, remained at the helm. My uncle, who for a short time had been withdrawn from his absorbing reveries by the novel incidents of this sea fight, fell back again apparently into a brown study. His eyes were fixed impatiently on the widespread ocean. Our voyage now became monotonous and uniform. Dull as it has become, I have no desire to have it broken by any repetition of the perils and adventures of yesterday. Thursday, August 20th. The wind is now NNE, and blows very irregularly. It has changed to fitful gusts. The temperature is exceedingly high. We are now progressing at the average rate of about 10 miles and a half per hour. About 12 o'clock a distant sound as of thunder fell upon our ears. I make a note of the fact without even venturing a suggestion as to its cause. It was one continued roar, as of a sea falling over mighty rocks. Far off in the distance, said the professor dogmatically, there is some rock, or some island, against which the sea, lashed to fury by the wind, is breaking violently. Hans, without saying a word, clambered to the top of the mast, but could make out nothing. The ocean was level in every direction as far as the eye could reach. 3 hours passed away without any sign to indicate what might be before us. The sound began to assume that of a mighty cataract. I expressed my opinion on this point strongly to my uncle. He merely shook his head. I, however, am strongly impressed by a conviction that I am not wrong. Are we advancing towards some mighty waterfall which shall cast us into the abyss? Probably this mode of descending into the abyss may be agreeable to the professor, because it would be something like the vertical descent he is so eager to make. I entertain a very different opinion. Whatever be the truth, it is certain that not many leagues distant there must be some very extraordinary phenomenon. For as we advance, the roar becomes something mighty and stupendous. Is it in the water, or in the air? I cast hasty glances aloft at the suspended vapors, and I seek to penetrate their mighty depths. But the vault above is tranquil. The clouds, which are now elevated to the very summit, appear utterly still and motionless, and completely lost in the irradiation of electric light. It is necessary, therefore, to seek for the cause of this phenomenon elsewhere. I examine the horizon, now perfectly calm, pure, and free from all haze. Its aspect still remains unchanged. But if this awful noise proceeds from a cataract, if this vast interior ocean is precipitated into a lower basin, if these tremendous roars are produced by the noise of falling waters, the current would increase in activity, and its increasing swiftness would give me some idea of the extent of the peril with which we are menaced. I consult the current. It simply does not exist. There is no such thing. An empty bottle cast into the water lies to leeward without motion. About 4 o'clock Hans rises, clambers up the mast, and reaches the truck itself. From this elevated position, his looks are cast around. They take in a vast circumference of the ocean. At last, his eyes remain fixed. His face expresses no astonishment, but his eyes slightly dilate. He has seen something at last, cried my uncle. I think so, I replied. Hans came down, stood beside us, and pointed with his right hand to the south. Derneri, he said. There, replied my uncle. And seizing his telescope, he looked at it with great attention for about a minute, which to me appeared an age. I knew not what to think or expect. Yes, yes, he cried in a tone of considerable surprise. There it is. What, I asked. A tremendous spurt of water rising out of the waves. Some other marine monster, I cried, already alarmed. Perhaps. Then let us steer more to the westward, for we know what we have to expect from antediluvian animals, was my eager reply. Go ahead, said my uncle. I turned towards Hans. Hans was at the tiller steering with his usual imperturbable calm. Nevertheless, if from the distance which separated us from this creature, a distance which must be estimated at not less than a dozen leagues, one could see the column of water spurting from the blowhole of the great animal, his dimensions must be something preternatural. To fly is, therefore, the course to be suggested by ordinary prudence. But we have not come into that part of the world to be prudent. Such is my uncle's determination. We accordingly continued to advance. The nearer we come, the loftier is the spouting water. What monster can fill himself with such huge volumes of water, and then unceasingly spout them out in such lofty jets? At 8 o'clock in the evening, reckoning as above ground, where there is day and night, we are not more than 2 leagues from the mighty beast. Its long, black, enormous, mountainous body lies on the top of the water like an island. But then sailors have been said to have gone ashore on sleeping whales, mistaking them for land. Is it illusion, or is it fear? Its length cannot be less than 1,000 fathoms. What, then, is this cetaceous monster of which no Cuvier ever thought? It is quite motionless and presents the appearance of sleep. The sea seems unable to lift him upwards. It is rather the waves which break on his huge and gigantic frame. The water spout, rising to a height of 500 feet, breaks in spray with a dull, sullen roar. We advance, like senseless lunatics, towards this mighty mass. I honestly confess that I was abjectly afraid. I declared that I would go no farther. I threatened in my terror to cut the sheet of the sail. I attacked the professor with considerable acrimony, calling him foolhardy mad, I know not what. He made no answer. Suddenly the imperturbable Hans once more pointed his finger to the menacing object. Home and island, cried my uncle. An island, I replied, shrugging my shoulders at this poor attempt at deception. Of course it is, cried my uncle, bursting into a loud and joyous laugh. But the water spout, geyser, said Hans. Yes, of course a geyser, replied my uncle, still laughing. A geyser like those common in Iceland. Jets like this are the great wonders of the country. At first I would not allow that I had been so grossly deceived. What could be more ridiculous than to have taken an island for a marine monster? But kick as one may, one must yield to evidence, and I was finally convinced of my error. It was nothing, after all, but a natural phenomenon. As we approached nearer and nearer, the dimensions of the liquid sheaf of waters became truly grand and stupendous. The island had, at a distance, presented the appearance of an enormous whale, whose head rose high above the waters. The geyser, a word the Icelanders pronounce geyser, and which signifies fury, rose majestically from its summit. Dull detonations are heard every now and then, and the enormous jet, taken as it were with sudden fury, shakes its plume of vapor, and bounds into the first layer of the clouds. It is alone. Neither spurts of vapor nor hot springs surround it, and the whole volcanic power of that region is concentrated in one sublime column. The rays of electric light mix with this dazzling sheaf, every drop as it falls, assuming the prismatic colors of the rainbow. Let us go on shore, said the professor, after some minutes of silence. It is necessary, however, to take great precaution, in order to avoid the weight of falling waters, which would cause the raft to founder in an instant. Hans, however, steers admirably, and brings us to the other extremity of the island. I was the first to leap on the rock. My uncle followed, while the eider duck hunter remained still, like a man above any childish sources of astonishment. We were now walking on granite, mixed with siliceous sandstone. The soil shivered under our feet like the sides of boilers, in which overheated steam is forcibly confined. It is burning. We soon came in sight of the little central basin from which rose the geyser. I plunged a thermometer into the water, which ran bubbling from the center, and it marked a heat of 163 degrees. This water, therefore, came from some place where the heat was intense. This was singularly in contradiction with the theories of Professor Hardwigg. I could not help telling him my opinion on the subject. Well, said he sharply, and what does this prove against my doctrine? Nothing, replied I dryly, seeing that I was running my head against a foregone conclusion. Nevertheless, I am compelled to confess that until now we have been most remarkably fortunate, and that this voyage is being accomplished in most favorable conditions of temperature. But it appears evident, in fact, certain, that we shall sooner or later arrive at one of those regions where the central heat will reach its utmost limits, and will go far beyond all the possible gradations of thermometers. Visions of the Hades of the ancients, believed to be in the center of the earth, floated through my imagination. We shall, however, see what we shall see. That is the professor's favorite phrase now. Having christened the volcanic island by the name of his nephew, the leader of the expedition turned away and gave the signal for embarkation. I stood still, however, for some minutes, gazing upon the magnificent geyser. I soon was able to perceive that the upward tendency of the water was irregular. Now it diminished in intensity, and then, suddenly, it regained new vigor, which I attributed to the variation of the pressure of the accumulated vapors in its reservoir. At last we took our departure, going carefully round the projecting and rather dangerous rocks of the southern side. Hans had taken advantage of this brief halt to repair the raft. Before we took our final departure from the island, however, I made some observations to calculate the distance we had gone over, and I put them down in my journal. Since we left Port Gretchen, we had traveled 270 leagues, more than 800 miles. On this great inland sea, we were, therefore, 620 leagues from Iceland, and exactly under England. Friday, August 21st. This morning the magnificent geyser had wholly disappeared. The wind had freshened up, and we were fast leaving the neighborhood of Henry's Island. Even the roaring sound of the mighty column was lost to the ear. The weather, if, under the circumstances, we may use such an expression, is about to change very suddenly. The atmosphere is being gradually loaded with vapors, which carry with them the electricity formed by the constant evaporation of the saline waters. The clouds are slowly but sensibly falling towards the sea, and are assuming a dark olive texture. The electric rays can scarcely pierce through the opaque curtain which has fallen like a drop seen before this wondrous theater, on the stage of which another and terrible drama is soon to be enacted. This time it is no fight of animals. It is the fearful battle of the elements. I feel that I am very peculiarly influenced, as all creatures are on land when a deluge is about to take place. The cumuli, a perfectly oval kind of cloud, piled upon the south, presented a most awful and sinister appearance, with the pitiless aspect often seen before a storm. The air is extremely heavy. The sea is comparatively calm. In the distance, the clouds have assumed the appearance of enormous balls of cotton, or rather pods, piled one above the other in picturesque confusion. By degrees, they appear to swell out, break, and gain in number what they lose in grandeur. Their heaviness is so great that they are unable to lift themselves from the horizon. But under the influence of the upper currents of air, they are gradually broken up, become much darker, and then present the appearance of one single layer of a formidable character. Now and then, a lighter cloud, still lit up from above, rebounds upon this gray carpet, and is lost in the opaque mass. There can be no doubt that the entire atmosphere is saturated with electric fluid. I am myself wholly impregnated. My hairs literally stand on end as if under the influence of a galvanic battery. If one of my companions ventured to touch me, I think he would receive rather a violent and unpleasant shock. About 10 o'clock in the morning, the symptoms of the storm became more thorough and decisive. The wind appeared to soften down, as if to take breath for a renewed attack. The vast funereal pall above us looked like a huge bag like the cave of Aeolus, in which the storm was collecting its forces for the attack. I tried all I could not to believe in the menacing signs of the sky, and yet I could not avoid saying, as it were involuntarily, I believe we are going to have bad weather. The professor made me no answer. He was in a horrible and a detestable humor to see the ocean stretching interminably before his eyes. On hearing my words, he simply shrugged his shoulders. We shall have a tremendous storm, I said again, pointing to the horizon. These clouds are falling lower and lower upon the sea, as if to crush it. A great silence prevailed. The wind wholly ceased. Nature assumed a dead calm, and ceased to breathe. Upon the mast, where I noticed a sort of slight ignis fatuus, the sail hangs in loose heavy folds. The raft is motionless in the midst of a dark heavy sea, without undulation, without motion. It is as still as glass. But as we are making no progress, What is the use of keeping up the sail, which may be the cause of our perdition if the tempest should suddenly strike us without warning? Let us lower the sail, I said. It is only an act of common prudence. No, no, cried my uncle, in an exasperated tone 100 times. No. Let the wind strike us and do its worst. Let the storm sweep us away where it will only. Let me see the glimmer of some coast of some rocky cliffs, even if they dash our raft into 1,000 pieces. No. Keep up the sail, no matter what happens. These words were scarcely uttered when the southern horizon underwent a sudden and violent change. The long accumulated vapors were resolved into water, and the air required to fill up the void produced became a wild and raging tempest. It came from the most distant corners of the mighty cavern. It raged from every point of the compass. It roared, it yelled, it shrieked with glee as if demons let loose. The darkness increased and became indeed darkness visible. The raft rose and fell with the storm, and bounded over the waves. My uncle was cast headlong upon the deck. I with great difficulty dragged myself towards him. He was holding on with might and main to the end of a cable, and appeared to gaze with pleasure and delight at the spectacle of the unchained element. Hans never moved a muscle. His long hair driven hither and thither by the tempest, and scattered wildly over his motionless face, gave him a most extraordinary appearance, for every single hair was illuminated by little sparkling sprigs. His countenance presents the extraordinary appearance of an antediluvian man, a true contemporary of the Megatherium. Still the mast holds good against the storm. The sail spreads out and fills like a soap bubble about to burst. The raft rushes on, at a pace impossible to estimate, but still less swiftly than the body of water displaced beneath it, the rapidity of which may be seen by the lines which fly right and left in the wake. The sail, I cried, making a trumpet of my hands, and then endeavoring to lower it. Let it alone, said my uncle, more exasperated than ever. Nay, said Hans, gently shaking his head. Nevertheless, the rain formed a roaring cataract before this horizon of which we were in search, and to which we were rushing like madmen. But before this wilderness of waters reached us, the mighty veil of cloud was torn in twain. The sea began to foam wildly, and the electricity, produced by some vast and extraordinary chemical action in the upper layer of cloud, is brought into play. To the fearful claps of thunder are added dazzling flashes of lightning, such as I had never seen. The flashes crossed one another, hurled from every side, while the thunder came pealing like an echo. The mass of vapor becomes incandescent. The hailstones which strike the metal of our boots and our weapons are actually luminous. The waves as they rise appear to be fire-eating monsters, beneath which seethes an intense fire, their crests surmounted by combs of flame. My eyes are dazzled, blinded by the intensity of light. My ears are deafened by the awful roar of the elements. I am compelled to hold on to the mast, which bends like a reed beneath the violence of the storm, to which none ever before seen by mariners bore any resemblance. Here my traveling notes become very incomplete, loose and vague. I have only been able to make out one or two fugitive observations, jotted down in a mere mechanical way. But even their brevity, even their obscurity, show the emotions which overcame me. Sunday, August 23rd. Where have we got to? In what region are we wandering? We are still carried forward with inconceivable rapidity. The night has been fearful, something not to be described. The storm shows no signs of cessation. We exist in the midst of an uproar which has no name. The detonations as of artillery are incessant. Our ears literally bleed. We are unable to exchange a word, or hear each other speak. The lightning never ceases to flash for a single instant. I can see the zigzags after a rapid dart strike the arched roof of this mightiest of mighty vaults. If it were to give way and fall upon us, other lightnings plunge their forked streaks in every direction, and take the form of globes of fire, which explode like bombshells over a beleaguered city. The general crash and roar do not apparently increase. It has already gone far beyond what human ear can appreciate. If all the powder magazines in the world were to explode together, it would be impossible for us to hear worse noise. There is a constant emission of light from the storm clouds. The electric matter is incessantly released. Evidently, the gaseous principles of the air are out of order. Innumerable columns of water rush up like waterspouts, and fall back upon the surface of the ocean in foam. Whither are we going? My uncle still lies at full length upon the raft, without speaking, without taking any note of time. The heat increases. I look at the thermometer. To my surprise, it indicates the exact figure is here rubbed out in my manuscript. Monday, August 24th. This terrible storm will never end. Why should not this state of the atmosphere, so dense and murky, once modified, again remain definitive? We are utterly broken and harassed by fatigue. Hans remains just as usual. The raft runs to the southeast invariably. We have now already run 200 leagues from the newly discovered island. About 12 o'clock the storm became worse than ever. We are obliged now to fasten every bit of cargo tightly on the deck of the raft, or everything would be swept away. We make ourselves fast, too, each man lashing the other. The waves drive over us, so that several times we are actually underwater. We had been under the painful necessity of abstaining from speech for 3 days and 3 nights. We opened our mouths, we moved our lips, but no sound came. Even when we placed our mouths to each other's ears, it was the same. The wind carried the voice away. My uncle once contrived to get his head close to mine after several almost vain endeavors. He appeared to my nearly exhausted senses to articulate some word. I had a notion, more from intuition than anything else, that he said to me, "We are lost." I took out my notebook, from which under the most desperate circumstances I never parted, and wrote a few words as legibly as I could. "Taken sail." With a deep sigh he nodded his head and acquiesced. His head had scarcely time to fall back, in the position from which he had momentarily raised it, then a disc or ball of fire appeared on the very edge of the raft tower devoted, our doomed craft. The mast and sail are carried away bodily, and I see them swept away to a prodigious height like a kite. We were frozen, actually shivered with terror. The ball of fire, half white, half azure colored, about the size of a 10-inch bombshell, moved along, turning with prodigious rapidity to leeward of the storm. It ran about here, there, and everywhere. It clambered up one of the bulwarks of the raft. It leaped upon the sack of provisions, and then finally descended lightly, fell like a football and landed on our powder barrel. Horrible situation. An explosion, of course, was now inevitable. By heaven's mercy, it was not so. The dazzling disc moved on one side. It approached Hans, who looked at it with singular fixity. Then it approached my uncle, who cast himself on his knees to avoid it. It came towards me, as I stood pale and shuddering in the dazzling light and heat. It pirouetted round my feet, which I endeavored to withdraw. An odor of nitrous gas filled the whole air. It penetrated to the throat, to the lungs. I felt ready to choke. Why is it that I cannot withdraw my feet? Are they riveted to the flooring of the raft? No. The fall of the electric globe has turned all the iron on board into lodestones. The instruments, the tools, the arms are clanging together with awful and horrible noise. The nails of my heavy boots adhere closely to the plate of iron encrustated in the wood. I cannot withdraw my foot. It is the old story again of the mountain of adamant. At last, by a violent and almost superhuman effort, I tear it away, just as the ball, which is still executing its gyratory motions, is about to run round it and drag me with it. Oh, what intense, stupendous light! The globe of fire bursts. We are enveloped in cascades of living fire, which flood the space around with luminous matter. Then all went out, and darkness once more fell upon the deep. I had just time to see my uncle once more, cast apparently senseless on the flooring of the raft. Hans at the helm, spitting fire under the influence of the electricity which seemed to have gone through him. "Whither are we going?" I ask. An echo answers, "Whither?" Tuesday, August 25th. I have just come out of a long fainting fit. The awful and hideous storm still continues. The lightning has increased in vividness, and pours out its fiery wrath like a brood of serpents let loose in the atmosphere. Are we still upon the sea? Yes, and being carried along with incredible velocity. We have passed under England, under the Channel, under France, probably under the whole extent of Europe. Another awful clamor in the distance. This time it is certain that the sea is breaking upon the rocks at no great distance. Then here ends what I call my journal of our voyage on board the raft, which journal was happily saved from the wreck. I proceed with my narrative as I did before I commenced my daily notes. What happened when the terrible shock took place, When the raft was cast upon the rocky shore, it would be impossible for me now to say. I felt myself precipitated violently into the boiling waves, and if I escaped from a certain and cruel death, it was wholly owing to the determination of the faithful Hans, who, clutching me by the arm, saved me from the yawning abyss. The courageous Icelander then carried me in his powerful arms, far out of the reach of the waves, and laid me down upon a burning expanse of sand, where I found myself some time afterwards in the company of my uncle, the professor. Then he quietly returned towards the fatal rocks, against which the furious waves were beating, in order to save any stray waifs from the wreck. This man was always practical and thoughtful. I could not utter a word. I was quite overcome with emotion. My whole body was broken and bruised with fatigue. It took hours before I was anything like myself. Meanwhile, there fell a fearful deluge of rain, drenching us to the skin. Its very violence, however, proclaimed the approaching end of the storm. Some overhanging rocks afforded us a slight protection from the torrents. Under this shelter, Hans prepared some food, which, however, I was unable to touch, and, exhausted by the 3 weary days and nights of watching, we fell into a deep and painful sleep. My dreams were fearful, but at last exhausted nature asserted her supremacy, and I slumbered. Next day when I awoke, the change was magical. The weather was magnificent. Air and sea, as if by mutual consent, had regained their serenity. Every trace of the storm, even the faintest, had disappeared. I was saluted on my awakening by the first joyous tones I had heard from the professor for many a day. His gaiety indeed was something terrible. "Well, my lad," he cried, rubbing his hands together, "have you slept soundly? Might it not have been supposed that we were in the old house on the Königstrasse, that I had just come down quietly to my breakfast, and that my marriage with Gretchen was to take place that very day?" My uncle's coolness was exasperating. Alas, considering how the tempest had driven us in an easterly direction, we had passed under the whole of Germany, under the city of Hamburg, where I had been so happy, under the very street which contained all I loved and cared for in the world. It was a positive fact that I was only separated from her by a distance of 40 leagues, but these 40 leagues were of hard, impenetrable granite. All these dreary and miserable reflections passed through my mind, before I attempted to answer my uncle's question. "Why, what is the matter?" he cried. "Cannot you say whether you have slept well or not?" "I have slept very well," was my reply, "but every bone in my body aches. I suppose that will lead to nothing." "Nothing at all, my boy. It is only the result of the fatigue of the last few days, that is all. You appear, if I may be allowed to say so to be very jolly this morning," I said. "Delighted, my dear boy, delighted, was never happier in my life. We have at last reached the wished-for port." "The end of our expedition," cried I, in a tone of considerable surprise. "No, but to the confines of that sea which I began to fear would never end, but go round the whole world. We will now tranquilly resume our journey by land, and once again endeavor to dive into the center of the earth." "My dear uncle," I began, in a hesitating kind of way, "allow me to ask you one question." "Certainly, Harry. A dozen, if you think proper. One will suffice." "How about getting back?" I asked. "How about getting back? What a question to ask. We have not as yet reached the end of our journey. I know that. All I want to know is how you propose we shall manage the return voyage." "In the most simple manner in the world," said the imperturbable professor. "Once we reach the exact center of this sphere, either we shall find a new road by which to ascend to the surface, or we shall simply turn round and go back by the way we came. I have every reason to believe that while we are traveling forward, it will not close behind us. Then one of the first matters to see to will be to repair the raft," was my rather melancholy response. "Of course, we must attend to that above all things," continued the professor. "Then comes the all-important question of provisions," I urged. "Have we anything like enough left to enable us to accomplish such amazing designs as you contemplate carrying out?" I have seen into the matter, and my answer is in the affirmative. Hans is a very clever fellow, and I have reason to believe that he has saved the greater part of the cargo. But the best way to satisfy your scruples is to come and judge for yourself. Saying which, He led the way out of the kind of open grotto in which we had taken shelter. I had almost begun to hope that which I should rather have feared, and this was the impossibility of such a shipwreck leaving even the slightest signs of what it had carried as freight. I was, however, thoroughly mistaken. As soon as I reached the shores of this inland sea, I found Hans standing gravely in the midst of a large number of things laid out in complete order. My uncle wrung his hands with deep and silent gratitude. His heart was too full for speech. This man, whose superhuman devotion to his employers I not only never saw surpassed, nor even equaled, had been hard at work all the time we slept, and at the risk of his life had succeeded in saving the most precious articles of our cargo. Of course, under the circumstances, we necessarily experienced several severe losses. Our weapons had wholly vanished, but experience had taught us to do without them. The provision of powder had, however, remained intact, after having narrowly escaped blowing us all to atoms in the storm. "Well," said the professor, who was now ready to make the best of everything, "as we have no guns, all we have to do is to give up all idea of hunting." "Yes, my dear sir, we can do without them, but what about all our instruments? Here is the manometer, the most useful of all, and which I gladly accept in lieu of the rest. With it alone I can calculate the depth as we proceed. By its means alone I shall be able to decide when we have reached the center of the earth. But for this little instrument we might make a mistake, and run the risk of coming out at the antipodes." All this was said amid bursts of unnatural laughter. "But the compass," I cried. "Without that what can we do? Here it is, safe and sound," he cried, with real joy. Ah, and here we have the chronometer and the thermometers. Hans the hunter is indeed an invaluable man." It was impossible to deny this fact. As far as the nautical and other instruments were concerned, nothing was wanting. Then, on further examination, I found ladders, cords, pickaxes, crowbars, and shovels, all scattered about on the shore. There was, however, finally the most important question of all, and that was provisions. "But what are we to do for food?" I asked. "Let us see to the commissariat department," replied my uncle gravely. The boxers which contained our supply of food for the voyage were placed in a row along the strand, and were in a capital state of preservation. The sea had, in every case, respected their contents, and to sum up in one sentence, biscuits, salt meat, sedum, and dried fish. We could still calculate on having about 4 months' supply, if used with prudence and caution. 4 months, cried the sanguine professor in high glee. Then we shall have plenty of time both to go and to come, and with what remains I undertake to give a grand dinner to my colleagues of the Johannium. I sighed. I should by this time have become used to the temperament of my uncle, and yet this man astonished me more and more every day. He was the greatest human enigma I ever had known. Now, before we do anything else, we must lay in a stock of fresh water. The rain has fallen in abundance, and filled the hollows of the granite. There is a rich supply of water, and we have no fear of suffering from thirst, which in our circumstances is of the last importance. As for the raft, I shall recommend Hans to repair it to the best of his abilities, though I have every reason to believe we shall not require it again." "How is that?" I cried, more amazed than ever at my uncle's style of reasoning. "I have an idea, my dear boy. It is none other than this simple fact. We shall not come out by the same opening as that by which we entered." I began to look at my uncle with vague suspicion. An idea had more than once taken possession of me, and this was, that he was going mad. And yet, little did I think how true and prophetic his words were doomed to be. "And now," he said, having seen to all these matters of detail, "to breakfast." I followed him to a sort of projecting cape, after he had given his last instructions to our guide. In this original position, with dried meat, biscuit, and a delicious cup of tea, we made a satisfactory meal. I may say one of the most welcome and pleasant I ever remember. Exhaustion, the keen atmosphere, the state of calm after so much agitation, all contributed to give me an excellent appetite. Indeed, it contributed very much to producing a pleasant and cheerful state of mind. While breakfast was in hand, and between the sips of warm tea, I asked my uncle if he had any idea of how we now stood in relation to the world above. For my part, I added, I think it will be rather difficult to determine. Well, if we were compelled to fix the exact spot, said my uncle, it might be difficult, since during the 3 days of that awful tempest, I could keep no account either of the quickness of our pace, or of the direction in which the raft was going. Still, we will endeavor to approximate to the truth. We shall not, I believe, be so very far out. Well, if I recollect rightly, I replied, our last observation was made at the Geyser Island, Harry's Island, my boy. Harry's Island. Do not decline the honor of having named it. Given your name to an island discovered by us, the first human beings who trod it since the creation of the world. Let it be so, then. At Harry's Island we had already gone over 270 leagues of sea. And we were, I believe, about 600 leagues, more or less, from Iceland. Good, I am glad to see that you remember so well. Let us start from that point, and let us count for days of storm, during which our rate of traveling must have been very great. I should say that our velocity must have been about 80 leagues to the 24 hours. I agreed that I thought this a fair calculation. There were then 300 leagues to be added to the grand total. Yes, and the Central Sea must extend at least 600 leagues. From side to side, do you know, my boy Harry, that we have discovered an inland lake larger than the Mediterranean? Certainly, and we only know of its extent in one way. It may be hundreds of miles in length. Very likely. Then, said I, after calculating for some minutes, if your previsions are right, we are at this moment exactly under the Mediterranean itself. Do you think so? Yes, I am almost certain of it. Are we not 900 leagues distant from Reykjavik? That is perfectly true, and a famous bit of road we have traveled, my boy. But why we should be under the Mediterranean more than under Turkey or the Atlantic Ocean can only be known when we are sure of not having deviated from our course. And of this we know nothing. I do not think we were driven very far from our course. The wind appears to me to have been always about the same. My opinion is that this shore must be situated to the southeast of Port Gretchen. Good, I hope so. It will, however, be easy to decide the matter by taking the bearings from our departure by means of the compass. Come along and we will consult that invaluable invention. The professor now walked eagerly in the direction of the rock where the indefatigable Hans had placed the instruments in safety. My uncle was gay and light-hearted. He rubbed his hands and assumed all sorts of attitudes. He was to all appearance once more a young man. Since I had known him, never had he been so amiable and pleasant. I followed him, rather curious to know whether I had made any mistake. In my estimation of our position, as soon as we had reached the rock, my uncle took the compass, placed it horizontally before him, and looked keenly at the needle. As he had at first shaken it to give it vivacity, it oscillated considerably, and then slowly assumed its right position under the influence of the magnetic power. The professor bent his eyes curiously over the wondrous instrument. A violent start immediately showed the extent of his emotion. He closed his eyes, rubbed them, and took another and a keener survey. Then he turned slowly round to me, stupefaction depicted on his countenance. "What is the matter?" said I, beginning to be alarmed. He could not speak. He was too overwhelmed for words. He simply pointed to the instrument. I examined it eagerly according to his mute directions, and a loud cry of surprise escaped my lips. The needle of the compass pointed due north, and the direction we expected was the south. It pointed to the shore instead of to the high seas. I shook the compass. I examined it with a curious and anxious eye. It was in a state of perfection. No blemish in any way explained the phenomenon. Whatever position we forced the needle into, it returned invariably to the same unexpected point. It was useless attempting to conceal from ourselves the fatal truth. There could be no doubt about it, unwelcome as was the fact that during the tempest there had been a sudden slant of wind, of which we had been unable to take any account, and thus the raft had carried us back to the shores we had left, apparently forever, so many days before. It would be altogether impossible for me to give any idea of the utter astonishment which overcame the professor on making this extraordinary discovery. Amazement, incredulity, and rage were blended in such a way as to alarm me. During the whole course of my life, I had never seen a man at first so chopfallen, and then so furiously indignant. The terrible fatigues of our sea voyage, The fearful dangers we had passed through had all gone for nothing. We had to begin them all over again. Instead of progressing, as we fondly expected, during a voyage of so many days, we had retreated. Every hour of our expedition on the raft had been so much lost time. Presently, however, the indomitable energy of my uncle overcame every other consideration. "So," he said, between his set teeth, "fatality will play me these terrible tricks. The elements themselves conspire to overwhelm me with mortification. Air, fire, and water combine their united efforts to oppose my passage. Well, they shall see what the earnest will of a determined man can do. I will not yield, I will not retreat even 1 inch, and we shall see who shall triumph in this great contest, man or nature." Standing upright on a rock, irritated and menacing, Professor Hardwigg, like the ferocious Ajax, seemed to defy the fates. I, however, took upon myself to interfere and to impose some sort of check upon such insensate enthusiasm. "Listen to me, uncle," I said, in a firm but temperate tone of voice. "There must be some limit to ambition here below. It is utterly useless to struggle against the impossible. Pray, listen to reason. We are utterly unprepared for a sea voyage. It is simply madness to think of performing a journey of 500 leagues upon a wretched pile of beams, with a counterpane for a sail, a paltry stick for a mast, and a tempest to contend with. As we are totally incapable of steering our frail craft, we shall become the mere plaything of the storm, and it is acting the part of madmen if we, a second time, run any risk upon this dangerous and treacherous central sea." These are only a few of the reasons and arguments. I put together reasons and arguments which to me appeared unanswerable. I was allowed to go on without interruption for about 10 minutes. The explanation to this I soon discovered. The professor was not even listening, and did not hear a word of all my eloquence. "To the raft," he cried in a hoarse voice, when I paused for a reply. Such was the result of my strenuous effort to resist his iron will. I tried again. I begged and implored him. I got into a passion, but I had to deal with a will more determined than my own. I seemed to feel like the waves which fought and battled against the huge mass of granite at our feet, which had smiled grimly for so many ages at their puny efforts. Hans, meanwhile, without taking part in our discussion, had been repairing the raft. One would have supposed that he instinctively guessed at the further projects of my uncle. By means of some fragments of cordage, he had again made the raft seaworthy. While I had been speaking, he had hoisted a new mast and sail, the latter already fluttering and waving in the breeze. The worthy professor spoke a few words to our imperturbable guide, who immediately began to put our baggage on board and to prepare for our departure. The atmosphere was now tolerably clear and pure, and the northeast wind blew steadily and serenely. It appeared likely to last for some time. What, then, could I do? Could I undertake to resist the iron will of 2 men? It was simply impossible if even I could have hoped for the support of Hans. This, however, was out of the question. It appeared to me that the Icelander had set aside all personal will and identity. He was a picture of abnegation. I could hope for nothing from one so infatuated with and devoted to his master. All I could do, therefore, was to swim with the stream. In a mood of stolid and sullen resignation, I was about to take my accustomed place on the raft, when my uncle placed his hand upon my shoulder. "There is no hurry, my boy," he said. "We shall not start until tomorrow." I looked the picture of resignation to the dire will of fate. "Under the circumstances," he said, "I ought to neglect no precautions. As fate has cast me upon these shores, I shall not leave without having completely examined them." In order to understand this remark, I must explain that though we had been driven back to the northern shore, we had landed at a very different spot from that which had been our starting point. Port Gretchen must, we calculated, be very much to the westward. Nothing therefore was more natural and reasonable than that we should reconnoiter this new shore upon which we had so unexpectedly landed. "Let us go on a journey of discovery," I cried. And leaving Hans to his important operation, we started on our expedition. The distance between the foreshore at high water and the foot of the rocks was considerable. It would take about half an hour's walking to get from one to the other. As we trudged along, our feet crushed innumerable shells of every shape and size once, the dwelling place of animals of every period of creation. I particularly noticed some enormous shells, carapaces, turtle and tortoise species, the diameter of which exceeded 15 feet. They had in past ages belonged to those gigantic glyptodons of the Pliocene period, of which the modern turtle is but a minute specimen. In addition, the whole soil was covered by a vast quantity of stony relics, having the appearance of flints worn by the action of the waves, and lying in successive layers one above the other. I came to the conclusion that in past ages the sea must have covered the whole district. Upon the scattered rocks, now lying far beyond its reach, the mighty waves of ages had left evident marks of their passage. On reflection, this appeared to me partially to explain the existence of this remarkable ocean, 40 leagues below the surface of the Earth's crust. According to my new and perhaps fanciful theory, this liquid mass must be gradually lost in the deep bowels of the Earth. I had also no doubt that this mysterious sea was fed by infiltration of the ocean above, through imperceptible fissures. Nevertheless, it was impossible not to admit that these fissures must now be nearly choked up. For if not, the cavern, or rather the immense and stupendous reservoir, would have been completely filled in a short space of time. Perhaps even this water, having to contend against the accumulated subterraneous fires of the interior of the earth, had become partially vaporized. Hence the explanation of those heavy clouds suspended over our heads, and the superabundant display of that electricity which occasions such terrible storms in this deep and cavernous sea. This lucid explanation of the phenomena we had witnessed appeared to me quite satisfactory. However great and mighty the marvels of nature may seem to us, they are always to be explained by physical reasons. Everything is subordinate to some great law of nature. It now appeared clear that we were walking upon a kind of sedimentary soil, formed like all the soils of that period, so frequent on the surface of the globe, by the subsidence of the waters. The professor, who was now in his element, carefully examined every rocky fissure. Let him only find an opening, and it directly became important to him to examine its depth. For a whole mile we followed the windings of the central sea, when suddenly an important change took place in the aspect of the soil. It seemed to have been rudely cast up, convulsionized, as it were, by a violent upheaving of the lower strata. In many places, hollows here and hillocks there attested great dislocations. At some other period of the terrestrial mass, we advanced with great difficulty over the broken masses of granite, mixed with flint, quartz, and alluvial deposits, when a large field, more even than a field, a plain of bones, appeared suddenly before our eyes. It looked like an immense cemetery, where generation after generation had mingled their mortal dust. Lofty barrows of early remains rose at intervals. They undulated away to the limits of the distant horizon and were lost in a thick and brown fog. On that spot, some 3 square miles in extent, was accumulated the whole history of animal life. Scarcely one creature upon the comparatively modern soil of the upper and inhabited world had not there existed. Nevertheless, we were drawn forward by an all-absorbing and impatient curiosity. Our feet crushed with a dry and crackling sound, the remains of those prehistoric fossils, for which the museums of great cities quarrel, even when they obtain only rare and curious morsels. 1,000 such naturalists as Cuvier would not have sufficed to recompose the skeletons of the organic beings which lay in this magnificent osseous collection. I was utterly confounded. My uncle stood for some minutes with his arms raised on high towards the thick granite vault which served us for a sky. His mouth was wide open. His eyes sparkled wildly behind his spectacles, which he had fortunately saved. His head bobbed up and down and from side to side, while his whole attitude and mien expressed unbounded astonishment. He stood in the presence of an endless, wondrous, and inexhaustibly rich collection of antediluvian monsters, piled up for his own private and peculiar satisfaction. Fancy, an enthusiastic lover of books, carried suddenly into the very midst of the famous Library of Alexandria, burned by the sacrilegious Omar, and which some miracle had restored to its pristine splendor. Such was something of the state of mind in which Uncle Hardwigg was now placed. For some time he stood thus, literally aghast at the magnitude of his discovery, but it was even a greater excitement when, darting wildly over this mass of organic dust, he caught up a naked skull and addressed me in a quivering voice. "Harry, My boy Harry, this is a human head. A human head, uncle, I said, no less amazed and stupefied than himself. Yes, nephew. Ah, Mr. Milne. Mr. G. Quatrefages. Why are you not here where I am, my professor? In order fully to understand the exclamation made by my uncle, and his allusions to these illustrious and learned men, it will be necessary to enter into certain explanations in regard to a circumstance of the highest importance to paleontology, or the science of fossil life, which had taken place a short time before our departure from the upper regions of the earth. On the 28th of March, 1863, some navigators, under the direction of M. Boucher de Perthus, were at work in the great quarries of Melanquignon, near in the department of the Somme, in France. While at work, they unexpectedly came upon a human jawbone buried 14 feet below the surface of the soil. It was the first fossil of the kind that had ever been brought to the light of day. Near this unexpected human relic were found stone hatchets and carved flints, colored and clothed by time in one uniform brilliant tint of verdigris. The report of this extraordinary and unexpected discovery spread not only all over France, but over England and Germany. Many learned men belonging to various scientific bodies, and noteworthy among others, Messrs. Milne Edwards and de Quatrefages, took the affair very much to heart, demonstrated the incontestable authenticity of the bone in question, and became the most ardent supporters of the jawbone question. To the eminent geologists of the United Kingdom, who looked upon the fact as certain Messrs. Falconer, Buck, Carpenter, and others were soon united the learned men of Germany, and among those in the first rank, the most eager, the most enthusiastic, was my worthy uncle, Professor Hutt. The authenticity of a human fossil of the Quaternary period seemed then to be incontestably demonstrated, and even to be admitted by the most skeptical. This system or theory, call it what you will, had, it is true, a bitter adversary in Émilie de Beaumont. This learned man, who holds such a high place in the scientific world, holds that the soil of Melanquignon does not belong to the diluvium, but to a much less ancient stratum, and, in accordance with Cuvier in this respect, he would by no means admit that the human species was contemporary with the animals of the Quaternary epoch. My worthy uncle, Professor Hardwigg, in concert with the great majority of geologists, had held firm, had disputed, discussed, and finally, after considerable talking and writing, Émilie de Beaumont had been pretty well left alone in his opinions. We were familiar with all the details of this discussion, but were far from being aware then that since our departure the matter had entered upon a new phase. Other similar jawbones, though belonging to individuals of varied types and very different natures, had been found in the movable grey sands of certain grottos in France, Switzerland, and Belgium, together with arms, utensils, tools, bones of children, of men in the prime of life, and of old men. The existence of men in the Quaternary period became, therefore, more positive every day. But this was far from being all. New remains, dug up from the Pliocene or Tertiary deposits, had enabled the more far-seeing or audacious among learned men to assign even a far greater degree of antiquity to the human race. These remains, it is true, were not those of men, that is, were not the bones of men, but objects decidedly having served the human race, shin bones, thigh bones, of fossil animals, regularly scooped out and in fact sculptured, bearing the unmistakable signs of human handiwork. By means of these wondrous and unexpected discoveries, man ascended endless centuries in the scale of time. He, in fact, preceded the mastodon, became the contemporary of the Elephas meridionalista, southern elephant, acquired an antiquity of over 100,000 years, since that is the date given by the most eminent geologists, to the Pliocene period of the Earth. Such was then the state of paleontologic science, and what we moreover knew sufficed to explain our attitude before this great cemetery of the plains of the Hardwigg Ocean. It will now be easy to understand the professor's mingled astonishment and joy, when, on advancing about 20 yards, he found himself in the presence of, I may say face to face with, a specimen of the human race actually belonging to the Quaternary period. It was indeed a human skull, perfectly recognizable, had a soil of very peculiar nature, like that of the cemetery of Saint Michel at Bordeaux, preserved it during countless ages? This was the question I asked myself, but which I was wholly unable to answer. But this head with stretched and parchmenty skin, with the teeth whole, the hair abundant, was before our eyes as in life. I stood mute, almost paralyzed with wonder and awe, before this dread apparition of another age. My uncle, who on almost every occasion was a great talker, remained for a time completely dumbfounded. He was too full of emotion for speech to be possible. After a while, however, we raised up the body to which the skull belonged. We stood it on end. It seemed, to our excited imaginations, to look at us with its terrible hollow eyes. After some minutes of silence, the man was vanquished by the professor. Human instincts succumbed to scientific pride and exaltation. Professor Hardwigg, carried away by his enthusiasm, forgot all the circumstances of our journey, the extraordinary position in which we were placed, the immense cavern which stretched far away over our heads. There can be no doubt that he thought himself at the institution, addressing his attentive pupils, for he put on his most doctorial style, waved his hand, and began, "Gentlemen, I have the honor on this auspicious occasion to present to you a man of the quaternary period of our globe. Many learned men have denied his very existence, while other able persons, perhaps of even higher authority, have affirmed their belief in the reality of his life. If the St. Thomases of paleontology were present, they would reverentially touch him with their fingers and believe in his existence, thus acknowledging their obstinate heresy. I know that science should be careful in relation to all discoveries of this nature. I am not without having heard of the many Barnums and other quacks who have made a trade of such like pretended discoveries. I have, of course, heard of the discovery of the knee bones of Ajax, of the pretended finding of the body of Orestes by the Spartiates, and of the body of Asterius, 10 spans long, 15 feet of which we read in Pausanias. I have read everything in relation to the skeleton of Trapani, discovered in the 14th century, and which many persons chose to regard as that of Polyphemus, and the history of the giant dug up during the 16th century in the environs of Palmyra. You are well aware, as I am, gentlemen, of the existence of the celebrated analysis made near Lucerne, in 1577, of the great bones which the celebrated Dr. Felix Plater declared belonged to a giant about 19 feet high. I have devoured all the treatises of Cassanian and all those memoirs, pamphlets, speeches, and replies published in reference to the skeleton of Teutobochus, king of the Scyths, the invader of Gaul, dug out of a gravel pit in Dauphine in 1613. In the 18th century, I should have denied, with Peter Campet, the existence of the pre-Adamites of Schweitzer. I have had in my hands the writing called Gigan. Here my uncle was afflicted by the natural infirmity, which prevented him from pronouncing difficult words in public. It was not exactly stuttering, but a strange sort of constitutional hesitation. The writing named Giggins, he repeated. He, however, could get no further. Gigantiu. Impossible. The unfortunate word would not come out. There would have been great laughter at the institution, had the mistake happened there. Gigantistiology at last, exclaimed Professor Hardwigg, between two savage growls, having got over our difficulty, and getting more and more excited. Yes, gentlemen, I am well acquainted with all these matters, and know, also, that Cuvier and Blumenbach fully recognized in these bones the undeniable remains of mammoths of the quaternary period. But after what we now see, to allow a doubt is to insult scientific inquiry. There is the body, you can see it, you can touch it. It is not a skeleton, it is a complete and uninjured body, preserved with an anthropological object. I did not attempt to controvert this singular, an astounding assertion. If I could but wash this corpse in a solution of sulfuric acid, continued my uncle, I would undertake to remove all the earthy particles, and these resplendent shells, which are encrusted all over this body. But I am without this precious dissolving medium. Nevertheless, such as it is, this body will tell its own history. Here the professor held up the fossil body, and exhibited it with rare dexterity. No professional showman could have shown more activity. As on examination you will see, my uncle continued, it is only about 6 feet in length, which is a long way from the pretended giants of early days. As to the particular race to which it belonged, it is incontestably Caucasian. It is of the white race, that is, of our own. The skull of this fossil being is a perfect ovoid, without any remarkable or prominent development of the cheekbones, and without any projection of the jaw. It presents no indication of the prognathism which modifies the facial angle. Measure the angle for yourselves, and you will find that it is just 90 degrees. But I will advance still farther on the road of inquiry and deduction, and I dare venture to say that this human sample or specimen belongs to the Japhetic family, which spread over the world from India to the uttermost limits of Western Europe. There is no occasion, gentlemen, to smile at my remarks. For the facial angle is formed by two planes, one, more or less vertical, which is in a straight line with the forehead and the incisors, the other, horizontal, which passes through the organs of hearing and the lower nasal bone. Prognathism, in anthropological language, means that particular projection of the jaw which modifies the facial angle. Of course nobody smiled, but the excellent professor was so accustomed to beaming countenances at his lectures that he believed he saw all his audience laughing during the delivery of his learned dissertation. Yes, he continued, with renewed animation, this is a fossil man, a contemporary of the mastodons, with the bones of which this whole amphitheater is covered. But if I am called on to explain how he came to this place, how these various strata by which he is covered have fallen into this vast cavity, I can undertake to give you no explanation. Doubtless if we carry ourselves back to the Quaternary epoch, we shall find that great and mighty convulsions took place in the crust of the earth. The continually cooling operation, through which the earth had to pass, produced fissures, landslips and chasms, through which a large portion of the earth made its way. I come to no absolute conclusion, but there is the man, surrounded by the works of his hands, his hatchets and his carved flints, which belong to the stony period, and the only rational supposition is, that, like myself, he visited the center of the earth as a traveling tourist, a pioneer of science. At all events, there can be no doubt of his great age, and of his being one of the oldest race of human beings. The professor with these words ceased his oration, and I burst forth into loud and unanimous applause. Besides, after all, my uncle was right. Much more learned men than his nephew would have found it rather hard to refute his facts and arguments. Another circumstance soon presented itself. This fossilized body was not the only one in this vast plain of bones, the cemetery of an extinct world. Other bodies were found, as we trod the dusty plain, and my uncle was able to choose the most marvelous of these specimens, in order to convince the most incredulous. In truth, it was a surprising spectacle, the successive remains of generations and generations of men and animals, confounded together in one vast cemetery. But a great question now presented itself to our notice, and one we were actually afraid to contemplate in all its bearings. Had these once animated beings been buried so far beneath the soil by some tremendous convulsion of nature, after they had been earth to earth and ashes to ashes, or had they lived here below, in this subterranean world, under this factitious sky, born, married, and given in marriage, and died at last, just like ordinary inhabitants of the earth? Up to the present moment, marine monsters, fish, and such like animals had alone been seen alive. The question which rendered us rather uneasy was a pertinent one. Were any of these men of the abyss wandering about the deserted shores of this wondrous sea of the center of the earth? This was a question which rendered me very uneasy and uncomfortable. How should they really be in existence? Would they receive us men from above? For a long and weary hour, we tramped over this great bed of bones. We advanced, regardless of everything, drawn on by ardent curiosity. What other marvels did this great cavern contain? What other wondrous treasures for the scientific man? My eyes were quite prepared for any number of surprises. My imagination lived in expectation of something new and wonderful. The borders of the great central ocean had for some time disappeared behind the hills that were scattered over the ground occupied by the plain of bones. The imprudent and enthusiastic professor, who did not care whether he lost himself or not, hurried me forward. We advanced silently, bathed in waves of electric fluid, by reason of a phenomenon which I cannot explain, and thanks to its extreme diffusion, now complete, the light illumined equally the sides of every hill and rock. Its seat appeared to be nowhere, in no determined force, and produced no shade whatever. The appearance presented was that of a tropical country at midday in summer in the midst of the equatorial regions, and under the vertical rays of the sun. All signs of vapor had disappeared. The rocks, the distant mountains, some confused masses of far-off forests, assumed a weird and mysterious aspect under this equal distribution of the luminous fluid. We resembled, to a certain extent, the mysterious personage in one of Hoffman's fantastic tales, The Man Who Lost His Shadow. After we had walked about a mile farther, we came to the edge of a vast forest, not, however, one of the vast mushroom forests we had discovered near Port Gretchen. It was the glorious and wild vegetation of the Tertiary period, in all its superb magnificence. Huge palms, of a species now unknown, superb Palmacytsa, genus of fossil palms, from the coal formation pines, yews, cypress, and conifers, or cone-bearing trees, the whole bound together by an inextricable and complicated mass of creeping plants. A beautiful carpet of mosses and ferns grew beneath the trees. Pleasant brooks murmured beneath umbrageous boughs, little worthy of this name, for no shade did they give. Upon their borders grew small tree-like shrubs, such as are seen in the hot countries on our own inhabited globe. The one thing wanting in these plants, these shrubs, these trees, was color. Forever deprived of the vivifying warmth of the sun, they were vapid and colorless. All shade was lost in one uniform tint, of a brown and faded character. The leaves were wholly devoid of verdure, and the flowers, so numerous during the Tertiary period which gave them birth, were without color and without perfume, something like paper discolored by long exposure to the atmosphere. My uncle ventured beneath the gigantic groves. I followed him, though not without a certain amount of apprehension. Since nature had shown herself capable of producing such stupendous vegetable supplies, why might we not meet with mammals just as large, and therefore dangerous? I particularly remarked, in the clearings left by trees, that had fallen and been partially consumed by time, many leguminous bean-like shrubs, such as the maple and other eatable trees, dear to ruminating animals. Then there appeared confounded together and intermixed, the trees of such varied lands, specimens of the vegetation of every part of the globe. There was the oak near the palm tree, the Australian eucalyptus, an interesting class of the order, Myrtaceae leaning against the tall Norwegian pine, the poplar of the north, mixing its branches with those of the New Zealand kauris. It was enough to drive the most ingenious classifier of the upper regions out of his mind, and to upset all his received ideas about botany. Suddenly I stopped short and restrained my uncle. The extreme diffuseness of the light enabled me to see the smallest objects in the distant copses. I thought I saw no, I really did see with my own eyes immense, gigantic animals moving about under the mighty trees. Yes, they were truly gigantic animals, a whole herd of mastodons, not fossils, but living, and exactly like those discovered in 1801, on the marshy banks of the Great Ohio, in North America. Yes, I could see these enormous elephants, whose trunks were tearing down large boughs, and working in and out the trees like a legion of serpents. I could hear the sounds of the mighty tusks uprooting huge trees. The boughs crackled, and the whole masses of leaves and green branches went down the capacious throats of these terrible monsters. That wondrous dream, when I saw the ante-historical times revivified, when the Tertiary and Quaternary periods passed before me, was now realized. And there we were alone, far down in the bowels of the earth, at the mercy of its ferocious inhabitants. My uncle paused, full of wonder and astonishment. "Come," he said at last, when his first surprise was over, "come along, my boy, and let us see them nearer." "No," replied I, restraining his efforts to drag me forward. "We are wholly without arms. What should we do in the midst of that flock of gigantic quadrupeds? Come away, uncle, I implore you. No human creature can with impunity brave the ferocious anger of these monsters." "No human creature," said my uncle, suddenly lowering his voice to a mysterious whisper. "You are mistaken, my dear Henry. Look yonder. It seems to me that I behold a human being like ourselves, a man." I looked, shrugging my shoulders. decided to push incredulity to its very last limits. But whatever might have been my wish, I was compelled to yield to the weight of ocular demonstration. Yes, not more than a quarter of a mile off, leaning against the trunk of an enormous tree, was a human being, a Proteus of these subterranean regions, a new son of Neptune keeping this innumerable herd of mastodons. Yes, it was no longer a fossil whose corpse we had raised from the ground in the great cemetery, but a giant capable of guiding and driving these prodigious monsters. His height was above 12 feet, his head as big as the head of a buffalo, was lost in a mane of matted hair. It was indeed a huge mane, like those which belonged to the elephants of the earlier ages of the world. In his hand was a branch of a tree, which served as a crook for this antediluvian shepherd. We remained profoundly still, speechless with surprise. But we might at any moment be seen by him. Nothing remained for us but instant flight. "Come, come," I cried, dragging my uncle along. And, for the first time, he made no resistance to my wishes. A quarter of an hour later, we were far away from that terrible monster. Now that I think of the matter calmly, and that I reflect upon it dispassionately, now that months, years, have passed since this strange and unnatural adventure befell us, what am I to think? What am I to believe? No, it is utterly impossible. Our ears must have deceived us, and our eyes have cheated us. We have not seen what we believed we had seen. No human being could by any possibility have existed in that subterranean world. No generation of men could inhabit the lower caverns of the globe without taking note of those who peopled the surface, without communication with them. It was folly, 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 nothing else. I am rather inclined to admit the existence of some animal resembling in structure the human race of some monkey of the first geological epochs, like that discovered by M. Lartet in the ossiferous deposit of Sainton. But this animal, or being, whichsoever it was, surpassed in height all things known to modern science. Never mind, however unlikely it may be, it might have been a monkey but a man, a living man, and with him a whole generation of gigantic animals. Buried in the entrails of the earth, it was too monstrous to be believed. During this time, we had left the bright and transparent forest far behind us. We were mute with astonishment, overcome by a kind of feeling which was next door to apathy. We kept running in spite of ourselves. It was a perfect flight, which resembled one of those horrible sensations we sometimes meet with in our dreams. Instinctively we made our way towards the central sea, and I cannot now tell what wild thoughts passed through my mind, nor of what follies I might have been guilty, but for a very serious preoccupation which brought me back to practical life. Though I was aware that we were treading on a soil quite new to us, I, however, every now and then noticed certain aggregations of rock, the shape of which forcibly reminded me of those near Port Gretchen. This confirmed, moreover, the indications of the compass and our extraordinary and unlooked for, as well as involuntary, return to the north of this great central sea. It was so like our starting point, that I could scarcely doubt the reality of our position. Streams and cascades fell in hundreds over the numerous projections of the rocks. I actually thought I could see our faithful and monotonous Hans in the wonderful grotto, in which I had come back to life after my tremendous fall. Then, as we advanced still farther, the position of the cliffs, the appearance of a stream, the unexpected profile of a rock, threw me again into a state of bewildering doubt. After some time, I explained my state of mental indecision to my uncle. He confessed to a similar feeling of hesitation. He was totally unable to make up his mind in the midst of this extraordinary but uniform panorama. There can be no doubt, I insisted, that we have not landed exactly at the place whence we first took our departure. But the tempest has brought us above our starting point. I think, therefore, that if we follow the coast, we shall once more find Port Gretchen. In that case, cried my uncle, it is useless to continue our exploration. The very best thing we can do is to make our way back to the raft. Are you quite sure, Harry, that you are not mistaken? It is difficult, was my reply, to come to any decision, for all these rocks are exactly alike. There is no marked difference between them. At the same time, the impression on my mind is that I recognize the promontory at the foot of which our worthy Hans constructed the raft. We are, I am nearly convinced, near the little port. If this be not it, I added, carefully examining a creek which appeared singularly familiar to my mind. My dear Harry, if this were the case, we should find traces of our own footsteps, some signs of our passage, and I can really see nothing to indicate our having passed this way. But I see something, I cried, in an impetuous tone of voice, as I rushed forward and eagerly picked up something which shone in the sand under my feet. What is it? Cried the astonished and bewildered professor. This was my reply, and I handed to my startled relative a rusty dagger of singular shape. What made you bring with you so useless a weapon? He exclaimed. It was needlessly hampering yourself. I bring it. It is quite new to me. I never saw it before. Are you sure it is not out of your collection? Not that I know of, said the professor, puzzled. I have no recollection of the circumstance. It was never my property. This is very extraordinary, I said, musing over the novel and singular incident. Not at all. There is a very simple explanation, Harry. The Icelanders are known to keep up the use of these antiquated weapons, and this must have belonged to Hans, who has let it fall without knowing it. I shook my head. That dagger had never been in the possession of the pacific and taciturn Hans. I knew him and his habits too well. Then what can it be unless it be the weapon of some antediluvian warrior, I continued, of some living man, a contemporary of that mighty shepherd from whom we have just escaped. But no mystery upon mystery, this is no weapon of the Stony Epoch, nor even of the Bronze period. It is made of excellent steel. I could finish my sentence. My uncle stopped me short, from entering upon a whole train of theories, and spoke in his most cold and decided tone of voice. Calm yourself, my dear boy, and endeavor to use your reason. This weapon, upon which we have fallen so unexpectedly, is a true dog, one of those worn by gentlemen in their belts during the 16th century. Its use was to give the coup de grace, the final blow, to the foe who would not surrender. It is clearly of Spanish workmanship. It belongs neither to you, nor to me, nor the eider-down hunter, nor to any of the living beings who may still exist so marvelously in the interior of the earth. What can you mean, uncle? I said, now lost in a host of surmises. Look closely at it, he continued. These jagged edges were never made by the resistance of human blood and bone. The blade is covered with a regular coating of iron mold and rust, which is not a day old, not a year old, not a century old, but much more. The professor began to get quite excited, according to custom, and was allowing himself to be carried away by his fertile imagination. I could have said something. He stopped me. Harry, he cried, we are now on the verge of a great discovery. This blade of a dagger you have so marvelously discovered, after being abandoned upon the sand for more than 100, 200, even 300 years, has been indebted by someone endeavoring to carve an inscription on these rocks. But this poniard never got here of itself, I exclaimed. It could not have twisted itself. Someone therefore must have preceded us upon the shores of this extraordinary sea. Yes, a man. But what man has been sufficiently desperate to do such a thing? A man who has somewhere written his name with this very dagger, man who has endeavored once more to indicate the right road to the interior of the earth. Let us look around, my boy. You know not the importance of your singular and happy discovery. Prodigiously interested, we walked along the wall of rock, examining the smallest fissures, which might finally expand into the much wished-for gully or shaft. We at last reached a spot where the shore became extremely narrow. The sea almost bathed to the foot of the rocks, which were here very lofty and steep. There was scarcely a path wider than 2 yards at any point. At last, under a huge overhanging rock, we discovered the entrance of a dark and gloomy tunnel. There, on a square tablet of granite, which had been smoothed by rubbing it with another stone, we could see 2 mysterious and much worn letters, the 2 initials of the bold and extraordinary traveler who had preceded us on our adventurous journey. "Yes," cried my uncle. "You see, I was right. Arn Saknussemm, always Arn Saknussemm." Ever since the commencement of our marvelous journey, I had experienced many surprises, had suffered from many illusions. I thought I was case-hardened against all surprises, and could neither see nor hear anything to amaze me again. I was like a man who, having been round the world, finds himself wholly blazon-proof against the marvelous. When, however, I saw these two letters, which had been engraven 300 years before. I stood fixed in mute surprise. Not only was there the signature of the learned and enterprising alchemist written in the rock, but I held in my hand the very identical instrument with which he had laboriously engraved it. It was impossible to deny the existence of the traveler, and the reality of that voyage which I believed all along to have been a myth, a mystification of some fertile brain. While these reflections passed through my mind, my uncle, the professor, gave way to an access of feverish and poetical excitement. "Wonderful and glorious genius, great Saknussemm," he cried. "You have left no stone unturned, no resource omitted, to show mortals the way into the interior of our mighty globe, and your fellow creatures can find the trail left by your footsteps. 300 years ago, at the bottom of these obscure subterranean abodes, you have secured for others the contemplation of these wonders of creation. Your name engraved at every important stage of your journey leads the hopeful traveler direct to the discovery. The audacious traveler, who shall follow your footsteps to the last, will doubtless find your initials engraved with your own hand upon the center of the earth. I will be that travel. I too will sign my name upon the central granite stone of this wondrous work. But in justice to your devotion, to your courage, and to your being the first to indicate the road, let this cape, seen by you upon the shores of this sea, discovered by you, be called, of all time, Cape Sa. This is what I heard, and I began to be roused to the pitch of enthusiasm indicated by those words. A fierce excitement roused me. I forgot everything. The dangers of the voyage and the perils of return were now as nothing. What another man had done in ages past could, I felt, be done again. I was determined to do it myself, and now nothing that man had accomplished appeared to me impossible. Forward, forward, I cried in a burst of genuine enthusiasm. I had already started in the direction of the somber gallery when the professor stopped me. He, the rash and hasty man, easily roused to enthusiasm, checked me, and asked me to be patient and show calm. "Let us return to Hans," he said. "We will then bring the raft down to this place." I yielded to my uncle's request, but not without dissatisfaction, and I hastened along the rocks of that wonderful coast. "Do you know, my dear uncle," I said, "that we have been singularly helped by chance? So you begin to see it, do you, Harry?" said the professor with a smile. "Doubtless," I responded, "and strangely enough, even the tempest has been the means of putting us on the right road." Blessings on the tempest. It brought us safely back to this spot. Supposing we had succeeded in reaching the southern and distant shores of this extraordinary sea, what would have become of us? The name of Saknussemm would never have appeared to us, and we should have been cast away upon an inhospitable coast. Yes, Harry, there is something providential in that wandering at the mercy of wind and waves towards the south. We have come back exactly north, and better still, we fall upon this great discovery of Cape Saknussemm. The coincidence is unheard of, marvelous. What matter? It is not our duty to explain facts, but to make the best possible use of them. Doubtless, my boy. But if you will allow me, said the delighted professor. Excuse me, sir, but I see exactly how it will be. We shall take the northern route. We shall pass under the northern regions of Europe, under Sweden, under Russia, under Siberia. And who knows where, instead of burying ourselves beneath deserts of Africa or beneath the mighty waves of the ocean. And that is all I care to know. Let us advance, and heaven will be our guide. Yes, Harry, you are right. All is for the best. Let us abandon this horizontal sea, which could never have led to anything. We shall descend, descend, and everlastingly descend. To reach the Earth's interior, only 5,000 miles. Bah! I cried, carried away by enthusiasm. The distance is scarcely worth speaking about. The thing is to make a start. My incoherent speeches continued until we rejoined Hans. All was prepared for departure, every parcel in its place. We took up our posts on the raft, and the sail being hoisted, Hans guided the bark towards Cape Saknussemm. The wind was very unfavorable to a craft unable to sail close to the wind. It was constructed to go before the blast. We were continually reduced to pushing forward by means of poles. On several occasions the rocks ran far out into deep water, and we were compelled to make a long round. At last, after 3 long and weary hours of navigation, we found a place to land. I jumped on shore first, In my present state of excitement and enthusiasm, I was always first. My uncle and the Icelander followed. The voyage had not calmed me. It had produced the opposite effect. I even proposed to burn the raft to cut off retreat, but my uncle sternly opposed this wild project. I began to think him lukewarm. At any rate, my dear uncle, I said, let us start without delay. Yes, my boy, I am quite as eager to do so as you. But first, let us examine this mysterious gallery. My uncle now began to see to the efficiency of our room coil. The raft, securely fastened to a rock, was left alone. Moreover, the opening into the new gallery was not 20 paces distant from the spot. Our little troop advanced with myself at the head. The orifice, almost circular, presented a diameter of about 5 feet. The somber tunnel was cut in the living rock, coated on the inside by material once passed through infusion. The lower part was level with the water, so we penetrated without difficulty. We followed an almost horizontal direction. When, at the end of about a dozen paces, our advance was checked by the interposition of an enormous block of granite rock. Accursed stone, I cried furiously, perceiving we were stopped by an insurmountable obstacle. In vain we looked right, left, above, below. There existed no passage, no sign of any tunnel. I experienced the most bitter disappointment. So enraged was I that I would not admit reality. I stooped, I looked under the mass of stone. No hole, no entrance. I then looked above, the same barrier of granite. Hans, with the lamp, examined the sides of the tunnel, all in vain. It was necessary to renounce hope of passing through. I seated myself upon the ground. My uncle walked angrily up and down, desperate. But, I cried, what about our insectnesum? You are right, replied my uncle. He can never have been checked by a lump of rock. No, 10,000 times, no, I cried. This huge lump, by some concussion, has closed the passage. Many years have passed since. Is it not evident this gallery was formerly the outlet for pent-up lava? Look at these fissures in the granite roof. It is evidently formed of pieces placed as an arch. One day, after a strong shock, the vast rock fell through and barred further progress. We are right in thinking Saknussemm did not meet this obstacle, and if we do not upset it in some way, we are unworthy of following him to the center of the earth. In this wild way I addressed my uncle. The zeal of the professor had become part of me. I wholly forgot the past. I despised the future. Nothing existed for me on the surface, not even Gretchen, who by this time would believe me utterly lost. Well, cried my uncle, let us go to work with pickaxes, crowbars, with anything that comes to hand. But it is too tough and too big, I replied. What then? As I said, it is useless to think of ordinary tools. What then? What else but gunpowder? A subterranean mine? Let us blow up the obstacle that stands in our way. Gunpowder. Yes, all we have to do is to get rid of this paltry obstacle. To work, Hans, to work, cried the professor. The Icelander soon returned with a crowbar, and began to dig a hole in the rock to serve as a mine. It was no slight task. It was necessary to make a cavity large enough to hold 50 pounds of fulminating gun cotton, whose expansive power is 4 times as great as ordinary gunpowder. I had now roused myself to miraculous excitement. While Hans was at work, I actively assisted my uncle. We prepared a long wick, made from damp gunpowder, the mass finally enclosed in a bag of linen. We are bound to go through, I cried. We are bound to go through, responded the professor, tapping me on the back. At midnight our work as miners was finished. The charge of fulminating cotton was thrust into the hollow, and the match, which we had made of considerable length, was ready. A spark was sufficient to ignite this formidable engine, and to blow the rock to atoms. We will now rest until tomorrow. It was absolutely necessary to resign myself to my fate, and to consent to wait for the explosion for 6 weary hours. The next day, which was the 27th of August, was a date celebrated in our wondrous subterranean journey. I never think of it even now, but I shudder with horror. My heart beats wildly at the very memory of that awful day. From this time forward, our reason, our judgment, our human ingenuity, have nothing to do with the course of events. We are about to become the plaything of the great phenomena of the earth. At 6 o'clock we were all up and ready. The dreaded moment was arriving when we were about to seek an opening into the interior of the earth by means of gunpowder. What would be the consequences of breaking through the crust of the earth? I begged that it might be my duty to set fire to the mine. I looked upon it as an honor. This task once performed, I could rejoin my friends upon the raft, which had not been unloaded. As soon as we were all ready, we were to sail away to some distance to avoid the consequences of the explosion, the effects of which would certainly not be concentrated in the interior of the earth. The slow match we calculated to burn for about 10 minutes, more or less, before it reached the chamber in which the great body of powder was confined. I should therefore have plenty of time to reach the raft and put off to a safe distance. I prepared to execute my self-allotted task, not, it must be confessed, without considerable emotion. After a hearty repast, my uncle and the hunter guide embarked on board the raft, while I remained alone upon the desolate shore. I was provided with a lantern which was to enable me to set fire to the wick of the infernal machine. "Go, my boy," said my uncle, "and heaven be with you. But come back as soon as you can. I shall be all impatience." "Be easy on that matter," I replied. "There is no fear of my delaying on the road." Having said this, I advanced toward the opening of the somber gallery. My heart beat wildly. I opened my lantern and seized the extremity of the wick. The professor, who was looking on, held his chronometer in his hand. "Are you ready?" cried he. "Quite ready." "Well then, fire away." I hastened to put the light to the wick, which crackled and sparkled, hissing and spitting like a serpent. Then, running as fast as I could, I returned to the shore. "Get on board, my lad, and you, Hans, shove off," cried my uncle. By a vigorous application of his pole, Hans sent us flying over the water. The raft was quite 20 fathoms distant. It was a moment of palpitating interest, of deep anxiety. My uncle, the professor, never took his eyes off the chronometer. "Only 5 minutes more," he said in a low tone. "Only 4, only 3. My pulse went 100 to the minute. I could hear my heart beating. "Only 2, 1. Now then, mountains of granite crumbled beneath the power of man. What happened after that? As to the terrific roar of the explosion, I do not think I heard it. But the form of the rocks completely changed in my eyes. They seemed to be drawn aside like a curtain. I saw a fathomless, a bottomless abyss, which yawned beneath the turgid waves. The sea, suddenly gone mad, became one great mountainous mass, upon the top of which the raft rose perpendicularly. We were all thrown down. In less than a second, the light gave place to the most profound obscurity. Then I felt all solid support give way, not to my feet, but to the raft itself. I thought it was going bodily down a tremendous well. I tried to speak, to question my uncle. Nothing could be heard but the roaring of the mighty waves. We clung together in utter silence, yet I thoroughly understood what had happened. Beyond the rock which had been blown up, there existed a mighty abyss. The explosion had caused a kind of earthquake in the soil, broken by fissures and rents. The gulf, thus suddenly thrown open, was about to swallow the inland sea. Transformed into a mighty torrent, it was dragging us with it. Only one idea filled my mind. We were utterly and completely lost. 1 hour, 2 hours, what more I cannot say, passed in this manner, elbow touching elbow, knee touching knee. We held one another's hands not to be thrown off the raft. We were subjected to violent shocks, whenever our sole dependence struck against the rocky sides of the channel. Fortunately, these concussions became less frequent. The gallery was widening. There could be now no doubt that we had chanced upon the road once followed by Saknussemm. But instead of going down in a proper manner, we had, through our own imprudence, drawn a whole sea with us. These ideas were vague. I felt rather than reasoned. Spinning along like a man going down a waterfall, I judged by the air that whipped my face we must have been rushing at a perfectly lightning rate. To attempt to light a torch was impossible. Our last Ruhmkorff coil had perished in the explosion. I was therefore amazed to see at last a bright light shining close to me. The calm countenance of the guide gleamed upon me. The patient hunter had succeeded in lighting the lantern. Though the draught nearly quenched it, it partly dissipated the obscurity. The gallery into which we had entered was very wide. The feeble light did not allow us to see both walls at once. The slope of waters that carried us away was far greater than that of the most rapid river. The surface seemed composed of liquid arrows. The raft, at times, caught in whirlpools, rushed forward, yet turned on itself. How it did not upset, I can never understand. When it approached the sides, I cast the lantern's light, and saw projecting rocks vanish as soon as they were seen. So rapid was our progress that distant points appeared like transverse lines enclosing us in a kind of net, like telegraphic wires. I believe we were now going at a rate of not less than 100 miles an hour. My uncle and I looked at one another with wild and haggard eyes. We clung convulsively to the stump of the mast, which had snapped short off. We turned our backs as much as possible to the wind, lest the speed should stifle us outright. Still the long monotonous hours went on. The situation did not change, though a discovery I suddenly made seemed to complicate it. When we had slightly recovered our equilibrium, I proceeded to examine our cargo and made a most alarming discovery. The greater part had utterly disappeared. Of all our nautical and philosophical instruments, there remained only the chronometer and the compass. The ladders and ropes were reduced to a short piece of cord fastened to the stump of the mast. Not a pickaxe, not a crowbar, not a hammer, and, far worse than all, no food, not enough for one day. This discovery was a prelude to a certain and horrible death. Seated gloomily, clasping the stump mechanically, I thought of starvation's miseries. History's tales of famine rushed back. I shuddered at the remembrance. Maddened, I persuaded myself I must be mistaken. I probed every crack, every joint and beam, every possible hiding place. The result simply nothing. Our stock of provisions consisted of nothing but a piece of dry meat and some soaked and half-moldy biscuits. I gazed around, scared and frightened. Supposing we had had food for months, how could we ever escape the abyss that hurled us onward? Why trouble ourselves about hunger when death stared us in so many swifter and perhaps more horrid forms? It was doubtful if we should have time to die of inanition, yet the mind forgot the immediate danger to fear the menaces of the future. Hope whispered, perhaps, we might escape the raging torrent and revisit the surface of our beautiful Mother Earth. How was it to be done? I had not the remotest idea. Where were we to come out? No matter, so that we did. One chance in 1,000 is still a chance, while hunger leaves none. I had a mind to reveal all to my uncle, to calculate how much time remained to live, but I held my tongue, like the Spartan boy. I wished to leave him all his coolness. At this moment, the light of the lantern slowly fell, and at last went out. The wick had wholly burnt to an end. The obscurity became absolute. It was no longer possible to see through the impenetrable darkness. There was one torch left, but it was impossible to keep it alight. Then, like a child, I shut my eyes, that I might not see the darkness. After a great lapse of time, the rapidity of our journey increased. The air's rush told me so. The slope of the waters became excessive. I began to feel that we were no longer going down a slope. We were falling. I felt as one does in a dream, going down bodily, falling, falling, falling. My uncle and Hans clasped my arms vigorously. Suddenly, after a lapse of time scarcely appreciable, I felt something like a shock. The raft had not struck a hard body, but had suddenly been checked. A waterspout, a liquid column, fell upon us. I felt suffocating. I was being drowned. Still, the sudden inundation did not last. In a few seconds, I felt myself once more able to breathe. My uncle and Hans pressed my arms, and the raft carried us all three away. Monsters of the deep were side by side with the mighty elephantine shepherd. Gigantic fish and animals seemed to form strange conjunctions. The raft took a sudden turn, whirled round, entered another tunnel singularly illuminated. The roof was formed of porous stalactite, through which a moonlit vapor appeared to pass, casting its brilliant light upon our gaunt and haggard figures. The light increased as we advanced. The roof ascended into a luminous cloud. At last, we were once more in a kind of water cavern, the lofty dome of which disappeared in radiance. A rugged cavern of small extent appeared to offer a halting place to our weary bodies. My uncle and the guide moved as men in a dream. I was afraid to waken them, knowing the danger of a sudden start. I seated myself beside them to watch. As I did so, I became aware of something moving in the distance, floating upon the water, advancing by seeming paddles. I looked with glaring eyes. One glance told me it was something monstrous. But what? It was the great shark crocodile of the early writers on geology, about the size of an ordinary whale, with hideous jaws and 2 gigantic eyes. It advanced, its eyes fixed on me with terrible sternness. Some indefinite warning told me that it had marked me for its own. I attempted to rise to escape, no matter where, but my knees shook. My limbs trembled violently. Still, the mighty monster advanced. My uncle and the guide made no effort to save themselves. With a strange noise, like none I had ever heard, the beast came on. His jaws were at least 7 feet apart, his mouth vast as a boat. We were about 10 feet distant when I discovered that, much as his body resembled that of a crocodile, his mouth was wholly that of a shark. His twofold nature now became apparent. To snatch us, he must first turn on his back. That motion would send his legs kicking helplessly in the air. I actually laughed even in the very jaws of death. But next minute, with a wild cry, I darted away into the interior of the cave, leaving my comrades to their fate. This cavern was deep and dreary. After about 100 yards, I paused and looked around. The whole floor, sand and malachite, was strewn with freshly gnawed bones of reptiles and fish, mingled with mammalia. My soul grew sick. I had truly fallen out of the frying pan into the fire. Some beast, larger and more ferocious even than the shark crocodile, inhabited this den. What could I do? The mouth was guarded by one monster. The interior held another. Flight was impossible. Only one resource remained, to find some small hiding place to which the fearful denizens could not penetrate. Gazing wildly, I discovered a fissure in the rock, to which I rushed to recover my scattered senses. Crouching down, I waited, shivering as in an ague fit. No man is brave in presence of an earthquake, a bursting boiler, or an exploding torpedo. I could not be expected to feel courage before the fearful fate that awaited me. An hour passed. I heard all the time a strange rumbling outside the cave. What was the fate of my unhappy companions? It was impossible to inquire. My own wretched existence was all I could think of. Suddenly, a dreadful groaning arose. Hisses, spitting, moaning hideous to hear, and then I saw never, were ages to pass. Shall I forget the horrible apparition? It was the ape Giggins, 14 feet high, covered with coarse hair of a blackish brown. It advanced. The hair on the arms, from shoulder to elbow, pointed downwards, from wrist to elbow upwards. Its arms were as long as its body, its legs prodigious, thick, long, sharply pointed, teeth like a mammoth saw. It struck its breast, smelling and sniffing. It reminded me of childhood tales of giants who ate the flesh of men and boys. Suddenly it stopped. My heart beat wildly. It had smelled me out and was peering with hideous eyes to discover my lurking place. My reading told me the truth. It was the ape Giggins, the antediluvian gorilla, the progenitor of the African monster, confined by fortune to the earth's interior. He glared, seeking something, doubtless myself. I gave myself up for lost. No hope of safety remained. At that moment, a strange noise came from the entrance. Turning, the gorilla recognized some enemy worthier. His strength? It was the huge shark crocodile, which, perhaps having disposed of my friends, came in search of further prey. The gorilla placed himself on the defensive, clutching a bone 7 or 8 feet long, a perfect club, and aimed a deadly blow. The hideous beast reared, then fell with all its weight upon its adversary. A terrible combat ensued. The struggle was awful and ferocious. I did not wait to witness the result. Regarding myself as the object of contention, I determined to remove from the victor's presence. I slid down, reached the ground, and crept toward the cavern's mouth. But I had not taken many steps when the fearful clamor ceased, followed by mumbling and groaning sounds of victory. I looked back and saw the huge ape, gory with blood, coming after me with glaring eyes and dilated steaming nostrils. I could feel his hot, fetid breath on my neck, and with a horrid jump woke from my nightmare sleep. Yes, it was all a dream. I was still on the raft with my uncle and the guide. Relief was not instantaneous. My senses were numbed. After a while, however, I was tranquilized. The first perception returning in full force was hearing. I listened keenly. All was still as death. The roaring waters had ceased. Perfect peace succeeded those awful reverberations. After some little time, my uncle spoke, low and scarcely audible. "Harry, boy, where are you?" "I am here," was my faint rejoinder. "Well, don't you see what has happened? We are going upwards." "My dear uncle, what can you mean?" "Yes, I tell you, we are ascending rapidly. Our downward journey is quite checked." I held out my hand and, after some difficulty, touched the wall instantly covered with blood. The skin was torn. We were ascending with extraordinary rapidity. The torch," cried the professor wildly. "It must be lighted." Hans, after many vain efforts, at last succeeded, and the flame, now unopposed, shed a tolerably clear light. We were enabled to form an approximate idea of the truth. "It is just as I thought," said my uncle. "We are in a narrow well, about 4 fathoms square. The waters of the great inland sea, having reached the bottom of the gulf, are now forcing themselves up the mighty shaft. We are cast on their summit." "That I can see," was my lugubrious reply. "But where will this shaft end, and to what fall are we exposed?" "Of that I am as ignorant as yourself. We should prepare for the worst. We are going up fearfully fast. As far as I can judge, we ascend at 2 fathoms a second, 120 fathoms a minute, more than 3.5 leagues an hour. At this rate, our fate will soon be certain." "No doubt," I said. "But does this shaft have any issue?" "It may end in a granite roof. We may be suffocated by compressed air, or dashed to atoms. I fancy the air is already close and condensed. I have difficulty breathing, whether fancy or speed." I certainly felt a great oppression of the chest. "Henry," said the professor, "our situation is to a certain extent desperate, yet many chances of safety remain. I have revolved them while you slept. Whereas we may at any moment perish, so at any moment we may be saved. We must prepare for whatever may turn up in the great chapter of accidents." "But what would you have us do?" I cried. "Are we not utterly helpless?" "No. While there is life, there is hope. At least, there is one thing we can do: eat. Thus obtain strength to face victory or death." As he spoke, I looked at my uncle with a haggard glance. I had put off the fatal communication as long as possible. It was now forced upon me, and I must tell him the truth, yet I hesitated. "Eat," I said deprecatingly, as if there were no hurry. "Yes, and at once. I feel like a starving prisoner," he said, rubbing his yellow shivering hands. Turning to the guide, he spoke cheering Danish words. Hans shook his head, terribly significant. I tried to look unconcerned. "What?" cried the professor. "You do not mean all our provisions are lost?" "Yes," I replied low, holding out something in my hand. "This morsel of dried meat is all that remains for us 3. My uncle gazed as if he could not appreciate my words. The blow stunned him by its severity. I allowed him to reflect for some moments. "Well," said I at last, "what do you think now? Is there any chance of escaping these subterranean dangers? Are we not doomed to perish in the great hollows of the center of the earth?" My questions brought no answer. My uncle either heard me not, or seemed not to do so. Thus a whole hour passed. Neither of us cared to speak. For myself, I began to feel devouring hunger. My companions, doubtless, felt the same tortures. Neither would touch the wretched morsel of meat. It lay there, the last remnant of our great preparations for this mad and senseless journey. I looked back with wonderment to my own folly. Fully was I aware that, despite his enthusiasm and the ever-to-be-hated scroll of Saknussemm, my uncle should never have started on his perilous voyage. Happy past and horrible future filled my brain. And yet, 3 months before I could tell my terrible story of starvation, as I thought it, as a boy, I used to make frequent excursions in the neighborhood of the professor's house. My uncle always acted on system, and he believed that, in addition to the day of rest and worship, there should be a day of recreation. In consequence, I was always free to do as I liked on a Wednesday. Now, as I had a notion to combine the useful and the agreeable, my favorite pastime was bird's nesting. I had one of the best collections of eggs in all the town. They were classified, and under glass cases. There was a certain wood, which, by rising at early morn, and taking the cheap train, I could reach at 11. Here I would botanize or geologize at will. My uncle was always glad of specimens for herbarium and stones to examine. When I had filled my wallet, I proceeded to search for nests. After 2 hours of hard work, I sat down by a stream to eat my humble but copious lunch. The remembrance of sausage, wheaten loaf, and beer made my mouth water now. While seated thus, I looked up at the ruins of an old castle, not far off, ivy-clad and falling to pieces. 2 eagles circled about the summit of a lofty tower. I soon became satisfied there was a nest. In all my collection, I lacked eggs of the native eagle and the large owl. My mind was made up. I would reach the summit of that tower, or perish in the attempt. I went nearer and surveyed the ruins. The old staircase had fallen in. The outer walls were intact. There was no chance that way, unless I looked to the ivy solely for support. Futile, as I soon found, there remained the chimney, still rising to the top, from every story. Up this I determined to venture. Narrow, rough, and therefore more easily climbed. I took off my coat and crept into the chimney. Looking up, I saw a small light opening, proclaiming the summit. Up I went, using hands and knees like a chimney sweep. Slow work, but continual projections made the task comparatively easy. In this way I reached halfway. The chimney narrowed. The air grew close. At last I stuck fast. I could ascend no higher. There remained no resource but to descend, and give up my glorious prey. I yielded, and endeavored to go down. I could not move. Some unseen obstacle intervened and stopped me. Horror seized me. Unable to move either way, I seemed doomed to a horrible death-starvation. Yet a boy's mind is elastic and hopeful. I began to think of plans to escape. For the present, I required no food. My excellent meal allowed reflection. First, I tried to move the mortar by hand. Had I possessed a knife, something might have been done, but that useful instrument lay in my coat pocket. All efforts were vain. I could only hope to wriggle downwards. Though I jerked and struggled and strove to turn, it was in vain. I could not move an inch. Time flew rapidly. Early rising helped to make me sleepy. Gradually, I yielded to drowsiness. I slept and awoke in darkness, ravenously hungry. Night had come, still I could not move. Tight bound, unable to change position an inch, I groaned aloud. Never since childhood had I truly experienced hunger. Novel and painful, it maddened me. I screamed in agony. Something startled, appeared a harmless lizard, to me a loathsome reptile. Again I made the ruins resound with my cries, and finally so exhausted myself that I fainted. How long I lay, I cannot say. When I recovered, it was day. How ill I felt, how hunger gnawed, it is hard to say. Too weak to scream or struggle. Suddenly I was startled by a roar. "Are you there, Henry?" My uncle's voice cried. "Are you there, my boy?" I faintly responded and tried to turn. Some mortar fell. To this I owed discovery. The searchers saw recent mortar and small stones fallen from above, hence my uncle's cry. "Be calm," he shouted. "If we pull down the whole ruin, you shall be saved." Delicious words, but I had little hope. Soon a voice sounded above, at an upper fireplace. "Are you below or above?" "Below," I replied. Instantly a basket was lowered, milk, a biscuit, an egg. He feared to be too ready with food. I drank the milk first. Thirst had deadened hunger. Then, refreshed, I ate bread and hard egg. They worked at the wall. I heard a pickaxe. Wishing to escape danger, I struggled. My belt, hitched on a stone, gave way. I was free. Only by rapid motion of hands and knees did I avoid falling. 10 minutes more, and I was in my uncle's arms, after 2 days and nights in that horrible prison. Occasional delirium had prevented me counting time. Weeks passed before I recovered from that starvation adventure. And yet what was that to the hideous sufferings I now endured? After dreaming and thinking of many matters, I looked around. We were still ascending with fearful rapidity. At times the air checked our respiration, as with over-rapid balloon ascents. But instead of cold with elevation, we felt the contrary. Heat increased threateningly. I think it must have reached 122 degrees Fahrenheit. What meant this extraordinary change? Hitherto facts had proved Davy and Lidenbrock correct. Refractory rocks, electricity, magnetism, had modified nature's laws and created for us moderate temperature. The theory of central fire, to me alone, explained. Were we approaching a region where phenomena were rigorous, heat reducing rocks to fusion? I did not conceal my fear. If not drowned or smashed, if not starved, we shall be burned alive. My uncle merely shrugged and resumed reflections. An hour passed. The temperature slightly increased. No incident changed our situation. At last my uncle spoke, cheerful. Well, Henry, my boy, we must make up our minds. To what? I asked, surprised. To something. We must recruit strength. If we husband our little remnant, we prolong a few hours but remain weak to the end. Yes, to the end, I growled. Only let a chance present itself. Where shall we find means to act if inanition reduces us? When this piece of meat is devoured, uncle, what hope remains? None, he said. But will devouring it with your eyes help? You reason like one without will. You have not lost hope, I cried, exasperated. Certainly not, he answered coolly. You mean we shall get out of this monstrous shaft? While there is life, there is hope, he said. As long as a heart beats and flesh quivers, a being with thought and will must not despair. Well, what do you mean to do? Eat what remains, swallow the last crumb. It will be, heaven willing, our last repast. Better men than exhausted skeletons. True, I muttered. Let us take our fill, we must. He sighed. He divided meat and biscuit into 3 parts. Each had 1 pound of food to last as long as we remained underground. Each acted by his nature. My uncle ate greedily, without appetite. I chewed without pleasure. Hans swallowed as if on an ordinary hunt, ready for superfluity or want. Hardy Icelandic nature had prepared him for suffering. So long as his 3 riksdaler came on Saturday, he was content. Suddenly my uncle saw a smile on Hans's face. What is the matter? He asked. Saddam, said the guide, producing a bottle. We drank. To our dying day we derived strength from that precious Hollands. The bottle was but half full. Nevertheless, it was nectar. The professor swallowed about half a pint and could drink no more. Fortreffelig, said Hans, finishing most. Excellent, very good, said my uncle, as if leaving the Hamburg Club. A gleam of hope came then vanished. We had consumed our last ounce of food. It was 5 in the morning. Man's health is negative. Once hunger is appeased, starvation seems unreal. After a long fast, a little moldy biscuit and salt beef triumphed over gloomy thoughts. Then each yielded to private reflections. I wondered at Hans the northern man with oriental resignation. I could not realize his inner truth. For me, thoughts were memories of the past. Of the upper world. I should never have left our house in the Königstrasse. Poor Gretchen, good Martha. Visions passed before me. Lugubrious groanings in the hollows seemed a distant murmur of great cities. My uncle, always the man of science, examined the shaft by torchlight, reading strata to recognize our situation only approximate, for the manometer was wanting. I heard him murmur, eruptive granite primitive epoch. We are going up, who knows? He felt the vertical sides nice micashy silicious. Good, the epoch of transition. We are close to the mand. Then could he measure the crust's thickness? No, yet temperature increased extraordinarily. We were bathed in burning atmosphere, like hot vapor in an iron foundry when liquid metal overflows. By degrees, we stripped coats and waistcoats. Even the slightest garment became suffering. Are we ascending to a living fire? I cried, as the heat grew greater. No, no, said my uncle. Impossible. And yet, said I, touching the wall, it is literally burning. I plunged my hands into the water to cool them, drew back with a cry. The water is boiling. My uncle made a gesture of rage and despair. Some truth had struck him. An invincible dread possessed me. I anticipated an immediate catastrophe. An idea, terrible, forced itself upon me. By torchlight I saw singular changes in the granite. Electricity played a part. The boiling water, the excessive heat. I examined the compass. It had gone mad, jumping from pole to pole, boxing the compass, running back as if with vertigo. The crust is never at repose. Internal currents and magnetism shake it incessantly. But other facts destroyed self-delusion. Terrible detonations multiplied like hundreds of laden chariots, madly driven over stones, a continuous roll of thunder. The mad compass confirmed my opinion. The mineral crust was about to burst. Granite masses would rejoin, the fissure close. The void be filled, we poor atoms crushed. Uncle, we are irretrievably lost. What now is your cause of alarm? He asked calmly. Do you not see the shaft's walls in motion? Feel the torrid heat. Observe the boiling water, the mad needle, every sign of earthquake. My uncle coolly shook his head. An earthquake? By no means. I expect something far more important. What do you mean? An eruption, Harry. An eruption, I gasped. We are in the volcanic shaft of a crater in full vigor. I think so, smiled the professor. And it is the most fortunate thing that could happen to us. Fortunate? Had he gone mad? What? We are in a well of burning lava, boiling water, every eruptive matter. We shall be expelled with granite blocks, cinders and scoriae, in a whirlwind of flame, and you say, the most fortunate thing. Yes, our only chance to escape. He looked calmly through his spectacles. He was right, never so audacious, so convinced as when he spoke of being cast upon Mother Earth through a gaping crater. Meanwhile, we still ascended. All night the fearful noise redoubled. I was ready to suffocate. My last hour seemed near. Yet childlike hypotheses overcame me. We were cast upward by eruptive matter. Beneath the raft, a mass of boiling water. Below it, heavier lava and rocks to be dispersed above. We were inside the chimney of a volcano, beyond doubt now of a mountain in full activity. What mountain? Where should we be shot out, as if it mattered? The compass, before madness, had ever pointed north. From Cape Saknessem, we had been swept northward many hundreds of leagues. Were we under Iceland, to be belched forth at Hekla or one of the 7 funnels? Westward, only little-known craters of Northwest America. Eastward, Jan Mayans-esque craters were not wanting. I often think now of my folly as, if I might escape. Towards morning, the ascent grew greater. Heat increased by local volcanic causes. An enormous force of vapors compressed within, hoisted us with irresistible power. Approaching day, what dangers awaited us? Instant death seemed our fate. Soon a dim sepulchral light penetrated the widening gallery. To right and left opened dark corridors, like immense tunnels. Horrid vapors poured. Tongues of fire crackled. The hour has come. Look, uncle. What you see are sulphurous flames culmin in eruption. But if they lap us round, they will not. The gallery widens. If necessary, we'll leave the raft and take refuge in a fissure. But the water, continually ascending. There is no longer water, Harry, but a lava paste, heaving us with itself to the crater's mouth. The liquid column had vanished. Dense boiling eruptive matter took its place. The temperature became utterly insupportable near 118.9 to 190 Fahrenheit. Perspiration rushed from every pore. But for our rapid ascent, we should have been stifled. The professor wisely kept us on the raft. Those ill-joined beams still offered a solid surface. Towards 8 in the morning, a new incident startled us. The ascensional movement suddenly ceased. The raft became motionless. What now? I cried. A simple halt, replied my uncle. Is the eruption about to fail? I hope not. I rose and looked around. Perhaps some rock checked us. Nothing of the kind. The column of cinders, scoriae, broken rocks, and earth had wholly ceased to ascend. The eruption has stopped, I said. You are wrong, my boy. Do not be alarmed. This calm will not last. It has endured 5 minutes. Before many more, we shall continue toward the mouth. He consulted his chronometer. Soon the raft shot upward again, rapid, disorderly, then stopped. Good, said my uncle, noting the hour. In 10 we shall start again. In 10 minutes. Precisely. We have to do with an intermittent volcano. We are compelled to breathe as it does. At the exact minute we were launched on high again. Not to be cast off, we clung to the beams. Then the hoist ceased. How many times it was repeated, I cannot say. Each rise came with increasing velocity, as if flung from a huge projectile. Each halt nearly stifled us. During projections, the hot air took away our breath. I longed for Hyperborean cold, 30 degrees below zero. My exalted imagination pictured snowy plains. I was impatient to roll upon the icy carpet of the North Pole. By degrees my head, overcome by violent emotions, yielded to hallucination. I was delirious. But for Hans's powerful arms, I should have broken my head against the granite. Hence I kept no account for many hours. I vaguely remember continual detonations, the shaking granite mass, the raft spinning like a top. It floated on hot lava amidst a falling cloud of cinders. Huge flames roared and wrapped us round. A storm of wind, as from an immense ventilator, roused the interior fires in incandescent blast. At last I saw Hans's figure, enveloped in a halo of blaze, and no sense remained but that sinister dread felt by the condemned at the cannon's mouth. When I opened my eyes, I felt the hand of the guide clutching me firmly by the belt. With his other hand he supported my uncle. I was not grievously wounded, but bruised all over in the most remarkable manner. After a moment I looked around, and found that I was lying down on the slope of a mountain, not 2 yards from a yawning gulf into which I should have fallen had I made the slightest false step. Hans had saved me from death, while I rolled insensible on the flanks of the crater. "Where are we?" dreamily asked my uncle, who literally appeared to be disgusted at having returned to earth. The eider-down hunter simply shrugged his shoulders as a mark of total ignorance. "In Iceland," said I, not positively but interrogatively. "Nay," said Hans. "How do you mean?" cried the professor. "No, what are your reasons?" "Hans is wrong," said I, rising. After all the innumerable surprises of this journey, a yet more singular one was reserved to us. I expected to see a cone covered by snow and widespread glaciers in the arid deserts of the extreme north beneath a polar sky. But contrary to all expectations, we were cast upon the slope of a mountain, calcined by the burning rays of a sun, literally baking us. We came out of the crater half naked, and the radiant star was prodigal of light and warmth we could have spared. When our eyes were accustomed to the light, I used them to rectify the errors of imagination. Whatever happened, we should have been at Spitzbergen, and I was in no humor to yield to anything but absolute proof. After some delay, the professor spoke. He said hesitatingly. "It really does not look like Iceland, but supposing it were the island of Jan Mayen." "Not in the least, my boy. This is not a volcano of the north, with granite hills and crown of snow. Nevertheless, look, my boy," said the professor dogmatically. Right above, at a great height, opened the crater of a volcano, which every quarter of an hour, with loud explosion, sent up a jet of flame mingled with pumice, cinders, and lava. I could feel the convulsions of nature in the mountain, which breathed like a huge whale, throwing up fire and air through enormous vents. Below, along a steep slope, a stream of eruptive matter spread away. The volcano did not exceed 300 fathoms in height. Its base disappeared in a perfect forest of green olives, fig trees, and vines loaded with rich grapes. Certainly this was not the ordinary aspect of the Arctic regions. Of that there could be no doubt. When the eye was satisfied with this verdure, it fell upon the waters of a lovely sea or beautiful lake, making of this enchanted land an island of not many leagues. To the rising sun lay a little port, crowded with houses, boats and vessels of peculiar build floating on azure waves. Beyond, groups of islands rose above the liquid plain, so numerous and close as to resemble a vast beehive. Toward the setting sun, distant shores edged the horizon-blue mountains of harmonious form. Farther still, a prodigiously lofty cone with dark heavy clouds above. Towards the north, an immense expanse of water sparkled, showing at times a mast's extremity or a sail's convexity bellying to the wind. The unexpected character of the scene added 100-fold to its marvels. "Where can we be?" I asked, low and solemn. Hans shut his eyes with indifference. My uncle looked on without clearly understanding. "Whatever this mountain may be," he said, "it is rather warm. The explosions do not leave off. Let us descend carefully. I am dying of hunger and thirst." Decidedly, the professor was no longer truly reflective. For myself, forgetting necessities and fatigue, I would have remained hours longer, but it was necessary to follow. The slope was steep and slippery. We slid over ashes, avoiding hot lava streams like fiery serpents. Advancing, I spoke volubly. Imagination exploded in words. "We are in Asia, on the coast of India, in the Malay Islands, in Oceania. We have crossed half the globe to come out at the antipodes of Europe. But the compass, exclaimed my uncle. Explain that. Yes, the compass, I said, hesitating. According to it, we always went northward. Then it lied. To say it lied is harsh. Then we are at the North Pole. The pole, no, well, I give it up. There was no explanation possible. All the while we approached the beautiful verdure. Hunger and thirst tormented us. Happily, after 2 hours' march, a country spread before us: olives, pomegranates, vines belonging to everybody. In destitution we did not ponder scruples. What delight to press delicious fruits to our lips, to bite grapes and pomegranates fresh from the vine. Not far off, near mossy grass under delicious shade, I discovered a spring of fresh water, in which we laved faces, hands, and feet. While we gave way to newfound pleasures, a little child appeared between 2 tufted olives. Ah, I cried, an inhabitant of this happy country. The poor, weak, suffering little fellow was terribly alarmed at our appearance, half naked, with tangled, ragged beards. Just as the boy was about to fly, Hans ran after and brought him back, despite cries and kicks. My uncle tried to look gentle, then spoke in German. What is the name of this mountain, my friend? The child made no reply. Good, said my uncle positively. We are not in Germany. He asked in English. The child shook his head. Is he dumb? The professor tried French. The boy only stared. I must try Italian, he said with a shrug. Dovnoisia. Yes, tell me where we are, I added eagerly. Again silence. My fine fellow, do you mean to speak? Cried my uncle, getting angry. He shook him and tried a dialect. Come see nome questa isola. What is the name of this island? Stromboli, replied the rickety little shepherd, dashing away and disappearing in the olives. Stromboli. What effect these few words produced. We were in the Mediterranean, amidst the eastern archipelago of myth, in ancient Strongylos, where Jolus chained the winds. Those blue mountains toward the rising sun were Calabria. The mighty volcano on the southern horizon was Etna, fierce, celebrated Etna. Stromboli, Stromboli, I repeated. My uncle played accompaniment to my gestures. We sang together like an ancient chorus. What a journey. We had entered the earth by one volcano, and come out by another more than 1,200 leagues, from Sneffels, from drear Iceland. We were transported to the most harmonious and beautiful of land's eternal snows, exchanged for infinite verdure. Grey fog, for Sicily's azure sky. After a delicious repast of fruits and fresh water, we continued towards the port of Stromboli. To say how we reached the island would scarcely be prudent. The superstitious Italians would call us demons from the infernal regions. It was necessary to pass for humble, shipwrecked travelers, striking and romantic, but safer. As we advanced, I heard my uncle mutter, but the compass, it most certainly marked north, a fact I cannot explain. Well, said I disdainfully, we must not explain anything, it will be easier. A professor of the Johanneum, unable to explain a cosmic phenomenon, would be strange, he said, becoming once more the terrible professor of mineralogy. An hour after leaving the olives, we reached the fort of San Vicenza, where Hans demanded the price of his 13th week of service. My uncle paid him, with very many warm shakes of the hand. At that moment, if he did not quite share our emotion, he allowed his feelings so far to give way as to indulge in an extraordinary expression for him. With the tips of 2 fingers, he gently pressed our hands and smiled. This is the final conclusion of a narrative, which will be probably disbelieved, even by people who are astonished at nothing. I am, however, armed at all points against human incredulity. We were kindly received by the Strombolite fishermen, who treated us as shipwrecked travelers. They gave us clothes and food. After a delay of 48 hours, on the 30th of September, a little vessel took us to Messina, where a few days of delightful and complete repose restored us to ourselves. On Friday, the 4th of October, we embarked in the Volturne, one of the postal packets of the imperial messageries of France. And 3 days later, we landed at Marseille, having no other care on our minds but that of our precious but erratic compass. This inexplicable circumstance tormented me terribly. On the 9th of October, in the evening, we reached Hamburg. What was the astonishment of Martha? What the joy of Gretchen? I will not attempt to define it. "Now then, Harry, that you really are a hero," she said. "There is no reason why you should ever leave me again." I looked at her. She was weeping tears of joy. I leave it to be imagined if the return of Professor Hardwigg made or did not make a sensation in Hamburg. Thanks to the indiscretion of Martha, the news of his departure for the interior of the earth had been spread over the whole world. No one would believe Atand when they saw him come back in safety. They believed it all the less. But the presence of Hans and many stray scraps of information by degrees modified public opinion. Then my uncle became a great man, and I the nephew of a great man, which, at all events, is something. Hamburg gave a festival in our honor. A public meeting of the Johanneum Institution was held, at which the professor related the whole story of his adventures, omitting only the facts in connection with the compass. That same day, he deposited in the archives of the town the document he had found written by Sakunzum, and he expressed his great regret that circumstances, stronger than his will, did not allow him to follow the Icelandic traveler's track into the very center of the earth. He was modest in his glory, but his reputation only increased. So much honor necessarily created for him many envious enemies. Of course they existed, and as his theories, supported by certain facts, contradicted the system of science upon the question of central heat, he maintained his own views, both with pen and speech, against the learned of every country. Although I still believe in the theory of central heat, I confess that certain circumstances, hitherto very ill-defined, may modify the laws of such natural phenomena. At the moment when these questions were being discussed with interest, my uncle received a rude shock, one that he felt very much. Hans, despite everything he could say to the contrary, quitted Hamburg. The man to whom we owed so much would not allow us to pay our deep debt of gratitude. He was taken with nostalgia, a love for his Icelandic home. "Farvel," said he, one day, and with this one short word of adieu, he started for Reykjavik, which he soon reached in safety. We were deeply attached to our brave eider duck hunter. His absence will never cause him to be forgotten by those whose lives he saved, and I hope, at some not distant day, to see him again. To conclude, I may say that our journey into the interior of the earth created an enormous sensation throughout the civilized world. It was translated and printed in many languages. All the leading journals published extracts from it, which were commentated, discussed, attacked, and supported with equal animation by those who believed in its episodes, and by those who were utterly incredulous. Wonderful. My uncle enjoyed during his lifetime all the glory he deserved, and he was even offered a large sum of money, by Mr. Barnum, to exhibit himself in the United States. While I am credibly informed by a traveler that he is to be seen in waxwork at Madame Tussauds, but one care preyed upon his mind, a care which rendered him very unhappy. One fact remained inexplicable, that of the compass. For a learned man to be baffled by such an inexplicable phenomenon was very aggravating. But heaven was merciful, and in the end my uncle was happy. One day, while he put some minerals belonging to his collection in order, I fell upon the famous compass and examined it keenly. For 6 months it had lain unnoticed and untouched. I looked at it with curiosity, which soon became surprise. I gave a loud cry. The professor, who was at hand, soon joined me. "What is the matter?" he cried. "The compass? What then? Why its needle points to the south and not to the north? My dear boy, you must be dreaming." "I am not dreaming. See, the poles are changed." Changed. My uncle put on his spectacles, examined the instrument, and leaped with joy, shaking the whole house. A clear light fell upon our minds. "Here it is," he cried, as soon as he had recovered the use of his speech. After we had once passed Cape Saknussemm, the needle of this compass pointed to the southward instead of the northward. Evidently, our error is now easily explained. But to what phenomenon do we owe this alteration in the needle? Nothing more simple. Explain yourself, my boy. I am on thorns. During the storm, upon the central sea, the ball of fire, which made a magnet of the iron in our raft, turned our compass topsy-turvy. "Ah!" cried the professor, with a loud and ringing laugh. It was a trick of that inexplicable electricity. From that hour, my uncle was the happiest of learned men, and I the happiest of ordinary mortals. For my pretty Verland girl, abdicating her position as ward, took her place in the house in the Königstrasse, in the double quality of niece and wife. We need scarcely mention that her uncle was the illustrious Professor Hartwig, corresponding member of all the scientific, geographical, mineralogical, and geological societies of the 5 parts of the globe. End of the voyage extraordinaire. The journey to the center of the earth by Jules Verne has come to an end, but the echoes of curiosity, courage, and the thirst for discovery will linger forever. What do you think if one day humanity truly discovered a hidden world beneath our feet? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share it with your friends, because your support is what gives me the motivation to keep bringing you more thrilling adventures in every new video.